Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku's soulmate phone revealed a harrowing fate? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Chapter 1. Chapter 1, Prologue. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Midoriya Inko first noticed that something wasn't quite right during her son's early childhood. The teal-colored flip phone he had been assigned at Biarch was meant to outline the key events in his soulmate's life by the hour, a sort of future diary, if you will, but unsettlingly, none of the things it predicted were in any way good at all. Mothers of newborn babies were advised to keep their child's cell either on them or someplace safe, as it was common knowledge both that A, were the phone to break, the owner would die, and B, that toddlers were typically incredibly clumsy. This, therefore, meant that the teal-colored flip phone remained safely stowed away in her bedside drawer both throughout the day and overnight. He could barely read yet, she told herself. Once he learned to read, then she'd entrust him with it. It had been a typical morning just like any other, Izuku on the carpet playing with his hero toys in gleeful tones and Inko folding laundry. This time it was her son's treasured All Might onesie, when, after withdrawing to her room briefly to rummage around for a spare hair tie after hers had snapped, she'd seen the notification LED blinking softly against the blue plastic of her son's cell. Although dim, the light stood out at a stark contrast to the darkness within the drawer, and caving to temptation she hesitantly opened the phone. She had only looked at it once before, and it hadn't been nice at all. This occasion was no different, and like before what she read made her stomach churn. She read through the lines of pixelated text, her eyes darting back and forth across the screen as she sank onto her bed. 6:02 p.m., combat training. 6:29 p.m., emergency break session. 6:31 p.m., resume combat training. 6:54 p.m., throw up. 7:01 p.m., resume combat training. Anger bubbled beneath the surface. Combat training? Soulmates were conventionally never much older than each other, so if she was going by that stereotype, then the poor child connected by fate to her son was being subjected to combat training at the age of 5. Not to mention the mere 2-minute break they'd been allowed before being no doubt forced back into training so vigorous they'd end up losing their dinner again. Immediately regretting her decision to look at her son's cell, she began closing it shut when a static noise sounded from its little speaker and she hurriedly opened it once more, peering tensely at the new words being written on the screen. The last line had been rewritten and exchanged for 2 new ones in its place. 6:56 p.m., nursed back to health. 6:57 p.m., taken to sister's bedroom during argument. Weight lifted from her shoulders. It wasn't the best possible outcome, and it never would be, but she was relieved to see that, wherever the poor child was, there was someone there looking out for them. Soon, she thought, soon I'll give it to him. He ought to know. Todoroki NG was a powerful man, and one that didn't like being told what to do. Especially regarding matters to do with his youngest son. What he said was final, and his word was law. To say that Shoto didn't like his father all that much would be a severe understatement. The training he received at his father's hands was brutal, and he hated the way he could hear his parents fighting through the walls. The walls had always been too thin. Often he would take refuge in his older sister's room, letting her comb through his hair with her fingers as he tried to block out the sounds of their raised voices, but it never lasted long. His father always shut her down after mere minutes, and eventually she stopped trying. One of the last proper arguments he ever heard from them had been about him. He's 6 now, NG. All the kids his age have their cells on them, it's not right. He deserves that basic right. Shoto didn't know what a cell was. He'd have to ask Fuyumine later. I do not want my son being distracted by that idiotic soulmate CRP. He's to focus on his hero training and that is that. No quirkless liability will come between him and that dream. Yes, I saw their diagnosis on the bloody flip phone thing. But NG dash. Are you contradicting me? Shoto winced at his father's raised voice, curling up into a ball where he sat against the paper-thin wall of his bedroom. The fight ended soon after that, and his mother had a painful-looking welt on her upper arm at dinner later that evening. Fuyumine, what's a cell? Oh, come over, look here's mine. Aku. Yeah, it tells me what my soulmate is doing right now. See? At a friend's house. Good. Yeah. I want one. Do I have one? I don't know when, but you will definitely get one. I promise you, Shoto. Leave him alone. Or what? You're just a useless idiot, Deku. He was surrounded and shielding a boy behind him, his cell in hand as he had been checking it not a moment before, but in his heart, he knew this was the right thing to do. He had to stand his ground no matter the risks. That's so mean, Kaken. If you don't stop, I'll dashed. He cast around wildly for things to say to the brash bully. I'll stop you myself. He was about to slip his flip phone in his pocket for safety when Bakugo's eyes seemed to catch sight of it, clutched in his little fist, and he grinned. Before Izuku could do so much as blink, Katsuki had lunged forward and wrenched the future diary from his palm. Izuku's BLD ran cold. His life was literally in the hands of his bully. Bakugo seemed to hold it up to the light to better inspect it, looking at the color and apparently boring pattern with distance before letting out a harsh bark of laughter. So lame, just like plain, stupid Deku? He taunted. Fit for purpose then? Crush it. One of them chanted, punching the air with a fist. Bakugo then did the unexpected. He rounded on his crony. What, are you a moron? No way, I'm no villain. And with that he tossed the flip phone back in Izuku's direction, said enough to stalk off in anger but not to actually do any real harm. If he noticed Izuku's ludicrously wild lunge to catch his cell, he didn't comment on it. Not long after his 7th birthday, Shoto had been sheltered in his sister's room after a particularly harrowing training session with his father when said sister suddenly opened the door and slipped into the safe haven. Breathing slightly, she leant against the wood grain of the door before pushing forward towards the bed, something small and slim clutched tightly in her hand. It looked like a cell, it was the right size and shape after all, but her own was white with tiny red polka dots. Shoto dash, she whispered, plunking down on the covers where he had been curled up, previously slumped over but now sitting straight, his full attention on his older sister. Taking his hands in hers, she pushed something into his palm and wrapped a hand around it, encasing it. Father went out and I know he never checks the drawer where he locked it, but I found the key while cleaning yesterday and it just isn't right that he's kept it from you for so long, but dash, she took a deep breath. It's about time you had your cell. She let go of his hands, and what lay there was a small, thin flip phone, red in color with thin white lines over top in a chevron pattern. Enthralled, he carefully opened it, and the screen came to life, the words, "Hello, Todoroki Shoto," visible on the pixelated screen. Fuyumi leant over his shoulder to see too, and then words, hundreds of characters began. Pouring on screen, unfamiliar events and times listed on each line. Speechless, he began reading. 3:45 p.m., be walked home from school. 4:03 p.m., arrive at home. 4:07 p.m., have grazes and burns treated. 4:42 p.m., eat ice cream. Shoto heard soft laughter from beside him and glanced over, dumbfounded at all the new information, to see Fuyumi smothering her chuckle behind her palm. Quite the klutz, your soulmate, huh? Getting grazes at school? Looking back at the screen, Shoto felt a small smile grace his lips. He hadn't been given much to smile about in recent years, but it was in these moments, away from his father, that he felt safe enough to let down his guard, even if only by a little. Sliding the small cell into the pocket on his shorts, he reached up and hugged his sister, who in turn patted him gently on the back, smiling softly. He wished times like these would never end. Mummy, what does this mean? Inko paused what she was doing, looking over paperwork, to see her 6-year-old son waving his teal-colored cell in the direction of her face, trying to clamber up onto the couch so she could see it better. Laughing, she hooked him under the arms and lifted him up onto the sofa and gently took the future diary from his clutches, beginning to scan over the words written there before gasping and placing a hand over her mouth. Oh, sweetheart. What is it, Mum? Little Izuku said, his brows furrowing as he tried to get up higher to peer over her shoulder at the cell, clutching the fabric of her blouse. Oh, honey, your soulmate, they're hurting a lot. She said as she discarded the cell on the tabletop, the words 11:07 a.m., laceration to the face, and 11:55 a.m., hospitalized, still visible on the screen. Sniffles could be heard from the boy currently burying his face into her shoulder, and she swiped a tissue from the box on the table, dabbing at the tear tracks forming on his face. I don't want them to hurt. He sobbed in between hiccups, trying to calm down. I know, sweetie, she soothed. But you've got to be strong. For them. She fought back her own tears at the prospect of the painful trials that awaited her only child, and struggled to keep her composure intact. When you meet them, they're going to need you, Izuku. So be strong. Shoto's mother was gone. Having awoken in the hospital and thrown straight back into training, the news had come one night when it had been made official at the dinner table by his own father. She was gone and she wasn't coming back. So you just focus on your training now, Shoto? His father barked, a glint of warning in his eyes. Shoto merely stood and took his plate from the table. He felt totally numb. Carrying it to the kitchen, he proceeded to clean it off and scrub at the crockery, wiping down the same section of porcelain 100 times over in his daze before retreating into his bedroom and not appearing again until sunrise. In future, he wouldn't be able to tell exactly when it had happened, but he'd guess in future that that was the night he vowed never to use his left side again, laying in bed watching the hourly updates on his cell until he fell asleep. Notes. I hope that the rather unique pacing isn't too patchy. Just to clarify, the future diary concept did come from Mirai Nikki, though I did simplify it, since in that show each person's diary serves a different purpose, unlike here. But I digress. I hope this first chapter was enjoyable, and drop a kudos or a comment telling me how to improve. I appreciate it. If you want, come yell at me on the Hell site. Chapter 2. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Midoriya, my boy. We must get back to work. Okay, just give me a sec. Izuku clicked a few buttons on his cell, scrolling down the hourly log and frowning slightly, his tongue sticking out at the corner of his mouth in concentration. He was atop the hood of a scrapyard car, and had pulled out his flip phone in boredom during his rest break just to get an update on how his soulmate was doing. It was his go-to activity, else he had nothing to do. It wasn't like he had many friends after all. Alright, he called, snapping the screen shut and discarding the cell in the sand beside his bag. He began shifting junk again. Scraps of old vehicles, abandoned furniture and broken appliances were just the tip of the iceberg in this area, and Izuku had already shifted a great deal of it since meeting his mentor and starting his one-for-all training regime. My boy Izuku's was concentrating so hard he barely heard All Might's call, and briefly stopped heaving the rusted fridge to huff out a wheezy yeah in reply. You're highly invested in your cell, everything all right? Yeah, he puffed out, starting to pull the heavy weight of the appliance again. That I just like to make sure they're okay when I have the chance, you know? Indeed. Very noble of you, my boy. All Might boomed. His training went on for a while longer in silence, and Izuku began to wonder whether his own mentor had a flip phone of his own. He must do if he was walking and talking, though Izuku had never once seen him with any kind of phone other than his actual phone, and that couldn't be the future diary since he'd seen All Might take a photo of him with it, and that certainly wasn't a feature his future diary had. Perhaps he didn't keep it on him? All Might did transform a lot, and would, therefore, risk damage to it if his clothes ripped and he lost it. He was also the world's greatest hero. Izuku supposed not a day went by where he wasn't put in life-threatening situations, and adding a breakable object that literally held your life within its confines into the mix was surely a foolish move. Then again, he'd seen a cell case on nearly all hero outfits these days, usually around the waist or hidden away in a jacket pocket for protection. Midoriya, my boy. What are you muttering about down there? Flustered that he had been quietly voicing his ramblings without realizing it, no less in front of the very person the ramblings had been about, he flushed crimson and shook himself, shooting an apologetic look All Might's way. I was just wondering if you had a future diary, All Might? Steeling himself for a good talking to, he tried to explain himself. Only I've never seen you with one. It would make perfect sense if you didn't carry it around, mind, and I know soulmates can be platonic, that's not even uncommon these days, and the news never dash. Whoa there, catch your breath. All Might guffawed, leaping down from his bird's eye perch on a large tractor and landing flashily in the sand. Izuku's shoulders relaxed, the tension leaving him as he realized All Might wasn't offended. Yes, I have a future diary, as every other living person on the planet does. My boy. Why yes of course. Midoriya stammered, wondering cautiously what the man before him would say next. I just don't take to carrying it around with me anymore. No point really, not when you're the symbol of peace, and everyone's safety is your top priority. He let out another bellowing laugh before powering down unexpectedly in a whoosh of smoke. Hacking slightly, he wiped at the corner of his mouth. Really ought to get a hang of this. Can't be doing that in a pressuring situation. Izuku watched as his mentor leant against the refrigerator he had been pulling minutes previously and sighed, taking that as an invitation to stop training for the day and lean against the scrap beside his mentor. He couldn't help but feel deep in his heart that All Might wasn't telling him the whole truth, but really, it wasn't his place anyway. He shouldn't have asked in the first instance. The sun was sinking low below the horizon already, and he'd need to be back soon if he wanted to avoid worrying his mother. The man beside him continued talking. I know you're probably worried about it, but don't be. Soulmates are confusing as hell, but trust me on this one. It'll all work out. So will everything else. Izuku watched as he reached out a hand cautiously and, after a moment, gently ruffled his hair. Though small, the gesture was immensely comforting, and he suddenly found himself missing the long-lost father-son relationship he'd never had. Why? All of a sudden, the man beside him seemed to expand, and in his place stood All Might in all his glory, beaming down at Izuku with that famous, winning smile. Because I am here. The day of the entrance exam came, and despite not being one to swear much, no such other vocabulary could properly do his situation justice. He was royally fed. Having ingested All Might's hair earlier that morning, a secret that he will take to his grave, he was now panicking about how long it'd be before it took effect. What if he went through the exam without it activating at all? What if it did activate and all his limbs were ripped off? Would it be painful? Hands shaking, he steeled himself against the odds and walked to the exam grounds behind everyone else, his mind flashing briefly to his teal flip phone stowed away in his bedside drawer. Having been advised by his mum to leave it behind, he had done as suggested, but it made him wonder. What on earth would Izuku's soulmate read in that next hour? Nervously hopping from one foot to another, he scanned the crowd of teenagers all currently awaiting instructions from in front of the large gates to the exam grounds. Everyone was enwrapped by the sheer size of the place, and as his eyes flicked from one face to another, his eyes landed on the girl he had met at the entrance that very morning, the one who had caught him mid-fall with whatever her quirk was. His eyes then fell upon something clutched in her hands, and he focused in on it, trying to see what it was. He noticed with a jolt that it appeared to be a flip phone, whether her future diary or an actual mobile, Izuku couldn't quite tell, but it was soft pink in color and had what appeared to be tiny black polka dots littering the surface. Intriguingly, he noticed little charms, quite a few of them, hanging from the corner of her phone, all clinking and brushing together, and jostling with every slight movement she made. They really were quite cute, and Izuku wondered why he hadn't seen more people with them on their cells, future diary or otherwise. No doubt they'd become a craze at some point. He began to wonder why on earth she even had her cell with her in the first place. Perhaps she was confident enough in herself that the exam would go smoothly and was therefore not worried about breaking it? From what he'd seen earlier, perhaps her quirk allowed her to do damage from afar. He realized that he was starting to analyze her based on very little evidence whatsoever, and so snapping out of his train of thought, I have to focus on the exam. He realized with a guilty jolt to the stomach that he ought to thank her for helping him at the school gate, but when Present Mick's booming voice sounded over the area, his mind was focused on far more pressing matters. Shoto stared at his phone incredulously as he lay in bed, anxiety building in his 10:59 a.m. Reminds self to buy a phone charm. 11 a.m. Begin entrance exam. 11:27 a.m. Break femurs and write humorous. 11:28 a.m. Destroy 0p enemy. 11:30 a.m. Lose consciousness. What the F were they doing? The morning of Shoto's first day at Yude Academy was tense and difficult. Breakfast for the Todoroki household was never a song and dance, and usually he simply grabbed a bowl of, well, anything, and retreated back into his room, if at all, but today NG had called a meal especially in light of the occasion. The only sounds that could be heard at the table were that of the clinking cutlery against porcelain and the almost indistinguishable clicked of both Shoto and Fuyumi's flip phones, her own real phone, and his future diary. Enji had long since discovered his hidden possession of the object, and Shoto had been severely punished for having stolen it from his father, absurd because it was his future diary. He had taken the blame for Fuyumi, and had also rejected her apology. She had nothing to apologize for after all, it wasn't her fault their father was an a-hole. It had seemed, however, that Enji Todoroki had had enough of his children's poor table manners, and so barked, "Get off them." When no one moved, he hissed, now venomously, and the siblings sighed, putting their respective devices on tables or in pockets. "Now," he said, more collected. "Shoto, you've got a big day ahead of you." Shoto did not for 1 second believe that his father was going to give him any sort of reassurance to calm his nerves, and he narrowed his eyes at the tamagoyaki on his plate in anguish. "You are to use your left side in any training today, do you understand me?" There it was. Refusing his father outright would mean a one-way ticket to turning up on his first day with fresh bruises, and so instead he opted to swallow his qualms and say nothing. Do nothing. Show no emotion either way. Wipe the slate clean. His father was watching him like a hawk, his eyes reduced to slits, and Shoto could almost hear Fuyumi's bated breath rattling around in her lungs, trying desperately to escape. "Go and get ready." Enji spat, malice dripping from every syllable. He didn't need telling twice. Grabbing his cell from the tabletop, he picked up his dish and took it quickly to the kitchen, loading it into the dishwasher and making his way to his room. Anything to get away from him. He was changed and ready in 10 minutes flat, nervously flattening his hair down over his left eye before grabbing his bag, phone, future diary and making a beeline for the front door. He had left the building and was almost at the road when a voice called him back. "Shoto." Turning around slowly, he saw his older sister stood nervously in the doorway to their house, shifting anxiously from foot to foot. He allowed his face to relax into the tiniest of smiles for a brief second, but that was all the permission she needed. Breaking out of some kind of invisible restraint, she hurried forward and seized him in a tight hug as though he may dissipate if she ever let go. Taken aback by the ferocity of her gesture, he gently pried her off and let her collect herself, waiting for her to speak as it was evident she had something to say. "Just dashed in internal conflict. Just have fun, yeah?" she said with a breathy laugh, her smile, for possibly the first time in a long while, reaching her eyes. "And stay safe." Nodding and letting the corner of his mouth quirk upwards by way of thanks, he readjusted the strap on his bag and turned away, making his way to the end of the street. Upon rounding the block, he saw out of the corner of his eye that his older sister had watched him retreat all the way down the street, visibly clutching the hem of her cardigan even from this distance. It struck Shoto that times like these must be very trying on his sister's mentality, because not only was it evident that she was glad he could finally get out of the house and away from their father, but also scared, as it meant that she'd have to start dealing with him all alone. Notes. I love writing this, I only hope that the pacing doesn't feel too rushed. Thank you all, by the way, for the amazing feedback I've had on the first chapter. Every new comment I get literally blasts away any insecurities I have with my writing, so thank you all so much. Leave a comment if there are any glaring problems, let me know. Or drop a kudos, both are highly appreciated. If you want, come yell at me on the Hell site. Chapter 3. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. It was safe to say that Izuku was nothing short of terrified standing before the enormous gates of U.High his first day of school. The tall glass building seemed to loom over him, rising higher and higher into the sky the more he looked at its pristine windows, the sun glaring off the reflective surface, dazzling. Gulping, he took a look at his wristwatch and realized that if he stood around any longer, he'd risk being late on his very first day. His feet felt like they were glued to the spot, cemented to the pavement, and it was with great effort that he wrenched them forward, taking a step onto U.A grounds and then breaking into a quick jog, his keys, mobile phone and cell all jangling around in his inside BRC pocket. Reaching the door to his classroom, he skidded to a halt, relieved to find that he could hear light chatter inside. He wasn't late after all. Shoving down all of his nerves, he wrenched it open and immediately began scanning the room, observing each new face and studying the space that would become his form room for the next year. The classroom was large, and after a brief head count, he determined there were around 20 desks, give or take. There was no teacher present yet, and so he began looking at his soon-to-be classmates. His eyes immediately found not only the Katsuki Bakugo oh god, but also the boy by the name of Tenya Ida, the very same boy who had reprimanded him in front of an entire ensemble of UA applicants during the entrance exam. Well, shit. Feeling his stomach drop to the floor, he began searching frantically for a desk he could escape to, and found there were 2 free seats, one on the back row beside a boy with red and white hair, and one in front of it behind Kaken. Well, he knew which of the 2 seats he'd be thoroughly avoiding. Shoto was way outside of his comfort zone in this classroom. Having never been exposed to many social situations, if any over the last decade, he really didn't know how to act in front of all these new people. Many of them were loud and raucous, having seemingly made friends already. He could see a student with matching pink hair and skin chatting amicably to a floating set of girls' uniform, no doubt the wearer was invisible, and a boy with many webbed arms conversing lightly with a boy possessing a bird-like head. He had reached into his pocket and was about to pull out his cell just for the excuse of something to do when he suddenly realized that he had no idea what the social code was regarding future diaries at such an age. For adults, using them in public was just the norm. His own parents had never used them much, though Shoto suspected that was to divert attention from the fact that neither his mother nor his father's cells had ever predicted the other's future, but he could imagine other parents using them rather nonchalantly, to see when their spouse would arrive home for dinner and the like. Even just that morning on the bus, Shoto had seen at least a handful of adults, dressed in smart business clothes and on their way to work, scrolling through the day's list of events. But in a high school, where tensions were high and everyone was nosy, would it be different? He briefly scanned the classroom to assess the situation. Of the 20 or so people present, he could see 3 visible flip phones, 2 of them not in use and simply out on the occupant's desk. Most other people either didn't have them out, hadn't brought them at all, he guessed, or were simply either too occupied with making new acquaintances to care about using theirs at present, or didn't want to have them out in the open where other people could pry. He concluded that, perhaps, people were generally warier about using them in a classroom, although that could just be a first day of term thing. Shoto then reminded himself, though, that he was probably overanalyzing it, and that he was the worst person to be judging any kind of social situation. It was at that moment that his attention was diverted by the door to the room sliding open again, and his eyes were drawn by the movement. A new student had arrived, just in time, no less, and a boy with fluffy green curls and more freckles than he had ever seen on one person nervously peered into the room. He looked almost comically afraid of what lay before him, and Shoto couldn't help but silently feel bad for the boy when the overzealous character of the Ida boy suddenly approached him and tried to make conversation. He propped his elbow up on his desk and sighed into his palm. Teenagers were unpredictable at best. It was during their physical quirk test that very morning that Shoto realized with a sinking feeling in his gut that not sitting the entrance exam like everyone else due to being accepted on recommendations had its drawbacks. He had no idea what everyone else's quirks were. Some were more obvious than others. He could tell just from one look what Hagakure, Shoji, and Ojiro's were, but he had yet to see anything visibly different from people like Uraraka, Yaoyorozu, and Kaminari. Having taken extra care to learn everyone's names, his questions were soon answered as the tests went on, though one candidate still mystified him. The boy with the fluffy green curls from earlier, Midoriya, his name had been on the register, hadn't yet displayed any kind of extraordinary ability, and the exams were almost over. Was he quirkless? Or merely biding time? UA had recently changed its policy to allow those that didn't possess quirks onto the courses, so it was a definite possibility. He couldn't be sure though. When the boy managed to almost outdo Bakugo, however, on the softball throw, he almost choked on air. He was taken aback, along with everyone else it seemed, though some seemed like they had been expecting it from him, damn it, missing that entrance exam. His eyes drifted from the boy's face to his finger, the one he had used to exert so much power into his throw, and saw him clutching it. It was purpling, bruised, and very obviously broken. Something seemed to rise up in the back of his memories and pull, and in his mind, he left the courtyard and he was back at the dining table that morning, sister on his left, father opposite him. He had been looking at his cell, at the future of his soulmate, and the last entry of the hour. 8:03 and leave home. 8:13 a.m., panic over bus fare. 8:14 a.m., find spare change on pavement. 8:24 a.m. arrive at school. 8:46 a.m. meet tutor. 9:01 a.m. break finger. Break finger? His soulmate was to break their finger at 9 o'clock. He roughly pushed back the material of his sleeve to check his watch for the time, but was dismayed to find that he'd taken it off that morning when changing into his gym kit. He had no way of telling the time, and glancing around it appeared no one else was wearing a watch either. He took a deep breath, in through the nose, out through the mouth, and rationalized. Could just be a coincidence. There was no way of telling for sure after all. It was possible that the prediction for his soulmate could have changed sometime between 8 o'clock that morning and now, right? It wasn't too uncommon. He had seen it change at least a couple of times in recent memory. Yeah, that was it. He hadn't found his soulmate yet. No need to panic. The boy with the fluffy curls wasn't in the next class, but returned during lunch. Shoto had dreaded lunch on the first day since the moment he'd gotten his acceptance letter. It was the be-all and all of friendship groups, or so he had been told, and he was never any good with other people. Hell, he'd never had a friend before. It wasn't like he had ever really cared though. At first, he had been upset when his father had forbidden him from playing with his siblings, but now he had concluded that he was at school to learn, and to become a hero first and foremost so he could prove his father wrong. So, when he'd been sitting alone at a table and a girl with long hair that had been pulled up into a ponytail set her tray down opposite him, he almost had a heart attack. He certainly hadn't expected to talk to anyone, but she smiled kindly enough, and after analyzing the situation and deciding that her presence didn't pose any threats to him, he gave a tiny nod and resumed eating his lunch in silence as she sat down. Hi. How do I respond? Hey. Shoto slapped himself mentally. Hey? What kind of a conversation starter was that? Silence, and then you're the other boy that got in on recommendations, right? He paused in his eating to glance up at her and was suddenly hyper-aware of the scar on the left side of his face. The compulsion to nervously flatten his hair down was strong, but he resisted and instead settled for smoothing out the creases in his uniform's blazer. Yeah, I am. And it felt wrong to not do anything after that. So instead he decided to extend a hand out across the table for her to take, and said, Todoroki Shoto. She grasped his palm and smiled at him. He noted that she had quite a strong grip, and replied with a confident, Yairozu Momo. They then fell into a companionable silence as they both picked up eating their food again, and Shoto's mind was screaming at him internally. Should he have said something more? Is this good silence or awkward silence? Will she judge him if he eats too loudly? What if his breath stinks and he ruined his first ever friendship all because he'd chosen a particularly fragrant lunch that day? He then noticed her reach into her pocket and pull out a small flip phone, and his stomach did a crazy flip. Did this mean using them wasn't a big deal after all? Or was Yairozu just confident enough that she didn't care what others thought? Did this mean she was bored in his presence? He kicked himself under the table and cursed himself in his head. He wasn't being rational. He'd known he'd be awkward on his first day, most people were, but this was a whole other extreme. Telling himself it wasn't as profound as he was making it out to be, he too took his own out after finishing his meal and took in the next hour's predictions. It was the usual boring stuff: go to class, make notes, and zone out in English, but his attention was abruptly diverted when his companion suddenly spoke. Oh, your pattern looks so cool. Is that original or a case? Slightly taken aback, he forced out a quick no, it's real, and nodded when she smiled. Thinking it might be rude if he didn't return the favor, he glanced up at her cell and took note of the pattern emblazoned on its outer casing. Her future diary was mostly red in color, a bright shade of crimson, but had small black and white stars littering the surface, contrasting nicely with the warm tones of scarlet. Yours is nice too. Really? I've always wanted to get a pattern case for mine, but my parents said they liked it. I know most people get a clear case for theirs for protection reasons, and I should probably do that sometime soon. As the lunch PRD came to a close, they both rose from the table and cleared their dishes, heading back towards class. They came to a halt at the door to the classroom, and she extended a hand out for him to shake. He took it, shaking it, before letting his hand fall to his side. "Well, it was nice talking to you, Todoroki." He directed a grateful nod in her direction, and with that, she shot him a small smile and pulled the door to Class 1 as homeroom open, stepping inside. As he returned to his desk, he saw her trail over to her own, stopping short at the seat of a girl with short, electric purple hair where she perched on the corner of the occupant's table, smiling down at her and speaking words Shoto could not quite hear. He realized watching the two interact that he really had no idea how to naturally socialize at all. Notes. Hope you enjoyed this chapter. Eve loved writing so far, happy face. Thank you for the support, and drop a comment or kudos if you enjoyed. If you want, come yell at me on the hell site. Chapter 4. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. All in all, Izuku concluded on his way home that his first day at today could have gone better. It wasn't terrible, but it could have gone better. Not only did he break his finger in front of the whole class, but he also seemed to have earned himself a spot on his homeroom teacher's hit list, managed to get himself put in the same class as Kaken, and ended up dozing off in English later that afternoon due to Recovery Girl's healing quirks sapping his stamina. He had only been jolted out of his daze when Jiru had tapped him on the shoulder asking for a spare pencil. He handed her one and then panicked upon realizing that he'd missed a section where Present Mike explained how to form a key English tense. His train of thought was interrupted, however, when he arrived at his front doorstep, realizing he'd been on autopilot the whole way home. Taking out his keys, he inserted the correct one into the lock, turned it, and pushed open the door, being careful to mind his broken finger. Immediately, he was greeted by the loudest, high-pitched squeal he had ever heard. "Izuku!" His mother came bounding around the corner, almost tripping down into the Genken in her haste to reach him. She stopped just short, though, when she noticed the bandages wrapped tightly around his index finger. "Oh Izuku, honey, what happened? You didn't get into a fight?" No, it was the physical test we did, don't worry, I'm fine." Recovery Girl patched it up, honest. "Does it still hurt?" "No." "Do you need an ice pack, sweetie? Would you like some ice cream?" "Why no, actually, and yes to that last part, please." The next morning Izuku had woken up to find his finger fully healed, which was a huge relief to him as he didn't think he could handle another day with sloppy handwriting when taking notes in lessons. His classmates seemed in awe of how quickly it had healed too, apparently. "Whoa," Uraraka exclaimed, holding his finger at eye level and inspecting it as though looking for scratches or bruises. "Wow, Recovery Girl is amazing." "Yes, indeed, it would appear so," Ida commented, fixing his glasses where they had slipped down on the bridge of his nose. "It is quite remarkable." He laughed nervously, trying to shake them off. It wasn't that he didn't want to talk to them, nothing would make him happier than getting to spend time with actual friends, it was that their first lesson of the day was about to start, and he didn't want to be told off for misdemeanor when he seemed to already be on his homeroom teacher's bad side. He could only hope that the man hadn't returned to the staff room after the quirk test and immediately trodden his name through the dirt with all the other teachers. He shook his head slightly, reminding himself that, no, the teachers at UA were professionals that wouldn't go around throwing their students under the bus. Right? Wow, he really needed to get his mind off things. His friends had returned to their own desks, and so he glanced around for something to do. No one sat to his left, and the desk in front of his belonged to Kaken, who was currently sitting with his feet up on his table, talking to Siro and occasionally letting out a bark of laughter. Tokoyami, sitting diagonally from him, was conversing with Koda, and so the only other person he could talk to was the boy to his immediate right, Todoroki Shoto. Todoroki was rather stoic and quiet, currently sitting with his elbow propped up on his desk and his chin resting on his palm, his face turned away from Izuku's. It didn't look as though he was interacting with anyone, however, so all he had to do now was find a way to break the ice. Izuku's eyes raked over the boy's desk and spotted a flip phone, lying face up at the corner of the table near his elbow. It was primarily red in color, with elegant white chevron details across the surface, and the pattern seemed to shine thanks to the clear protective case he had put on it. He thought, rather foolishly, that it suited him. Foolish because he barely knew the guy. But perhaps now was the time to change that, if they were going to be sitting beside each other the rest of the year, and what better way to spend the time than making new acquaintances? Plucking up his courage, he cleared his throat with a brief cough and spoke. Excuse me dash. The boy seemed to have heard him, as his head raised a little off his hand and slowly turned to face him, shifting his weight to better get a look at who had addressed him. The boy's palm came to rest on the wooden desktop, and for the first time, Izuku got a proper look at his face. Any smart or witty conversation starters left his brain in an instant, as Todoroki certainly lived up to his pretty boy title. His hair, snowy white on one side and red on the other, holy see, is that natural? Fell across his face and into his eyes slightly. He possessed heterochromia, one eye a deep brown and the other a bright blue, and Izuku felt winded just looking at him. He barely even registered the scar across the left side of the boy's face, but when he did something strange from deep within his memories, from long ago, seemed to tug on his mind, seemed to rise to the surface. A long complicated word he couldn't understand, they're hurting Izuku, and then going to his room to look up the word's meaning. Laceration, a deep wound or tear in skin or flesh. He jolted back to the present day and mentally shook the memory off. Now is not the time to be thinking about your soulmate, he told himself. The boy ped his head to one side in a questioning manner, which reminded Izuku that he had engaged this boy's attention for a purpose. Your phone? He pointed to it lamely. The pattern's really nice. It's quite striking, almost elegant? Pretty? The boy before him seemed to sit up straighter as he realized what Izuku was talking about, his eyes widening a fraction as he glanced at said flip phone and then back to Izuku's face. If he hadn't read Todoroki's face incorrectly, he'd almost say he looked slightly afraid. Thank you. Yeah, Izuku plowed on, bolstered from having a positive response and trying to show his classmate that he had nothing to worry about, he meant no harm. It suits you. Just thought I'd let you know. For a brief, blissfully ignorant moment, he wondered innocently why the boy beside him looked so taken aback, shocked, and almost embarrassed. And then it struck him, and he almost sheet himself. He had essentially just called the boy pretty, to his face. He felt the heat of embarrassment immediately rise to his face and fought to suppress it, and thank the heavens, someone must be watching over him from above, for he had never been happier to see a teacher enter the room in his life. Izuku had known all his life he was quite awkward, muttered all the time, and had a habit of getting embarrassed in front of other people, but that he'd really outdone himself this time. When Shoto had discovered that All Might himself was to be teaching him in his first year at Uta High, a sheet-eating grin had made its way onto his face for the first time in years. No better way to PSS off his dad than having his son taught by his ultimate rival for a whole year. In that respect, he had been looking forward to their first lesson with said pro-hero, but now, sitting before the man, he wasn't hearing a word he was saying. All he could focus on, in the weirdest way, was the interaction he'd had with Midoriya, the starstruck look the boy had worn when Shoto had turned around. Like recognition of some sort. Okay, all of you, go and get changed, and I want all of yourselves safely away, alright? The room suddenly erupted with motion as the walls opened up and revealed everyone's tailored hero outfits for the first time. People scrambled to grab theirs, and standing up slowly, in a sort of haze, Shoto made a split-second decision. Where other people had stowed their future diaries into bags and desk drawers, he swiped his from his desk and slipped it into his pocket before locating outfit number 15, taking it from the shelf and following the rest of his class to the changing rooms. The circumstances were too aligned, made too much sense, and this was the best way of confirming his hunch. Of course, All Might would get them all to do a dangerous practical simulation in their first lesson with him. He had decided to split the class by drawing lots. Team A consisted of Midoriya and Uraraka, Team D with Bakugo and Ida, and the two pairs would be going head-to-head before anyone else. Shoto was merely glad that he was on neither Midoriya nor Bakugo's team. He wanted time to observe Midoriya's actions, and didn't particularly feel like trying to cooperate with a headstrong explosion wielder either. Hats off to you, Ida. While his classmates gathered around their teacher and mentor to get as close to the monitors as possible, he hung back and stayed behind everyone else where the focus wouldn't be on him. He wasn't one to break the rules, but this was the perfect opportunity to confirm his suspicions, and he would prefer not to be caught doing something that had been specifically advised against by the world's top hero. Making sure he could still see the screens displaying the battlefield, though, he did a quick scan of the room, ensured everyone had their backs to him, and flipped open his red and white cell. Once the battle started, all Izuku could focus on was the challenge ahead. All thoughts of soulmates and school work temporarily vacated his brain and were instead replaced by strategies. Strategies on how to get past Kaken, ways to either subdue his opponents or claim the weapon, and methods of reducing collateral damage as much as possible when not only his quirk, but his opponent's quirk too, was incredibly powerful and incredibly destructive when misused. Sneaking through the building that had been assigned to them for their fight, he fought to suppress his anxiety. So far he hadn't seen hide nor hair of his explosive rival and was growing more nervous by the second. Unbeknownst to him, a boy up in the viewing tower was waiting with bated breath, eyes glued to a monitor displaying a hero with fluffy green curls, for the time to roll around to 10:34 a.m., when his soulmate was to be ambushed. And so barely a minute later, Shoto Todoroki was forced to watch on as a ruthless Katsuki Bakugo leapt out of the shadows of an adjoining corridor, creating an explosion right beside Midoriya Izuku's head. 10:35 a.m. Subdue opponent. Midoriya bodily throws Bakugo over his shoulder and sends him crashing into the concrete. 10:39 a.m. Hit by explosion. Midoriya is caught in the blaze of a supercharged fireball, destroying some of his hero suit. 10:45 a.m. Explosion assault. Bakugo smashes Midoriya's elbow with his gauntlet before aiming a powerful explosion directly at his back. Shoto pales at the sight of the boy visibly crying out in agony on the CCTV monitor. "They're gonna kill each other. Sir?" Kirishima yelled out. The whole class watched on in horror as Bakugo's gloved palm glowed white-hot and Midoriya's arms lit up with a crackling red energy. Shoto glanced quickly down at his future diary, eyebrows knitting together in bewilderment as his mind registered the words written on screen. 10:52 a.m. All 5 floors of building destroyed. His head shot back up, eyes locking onto the monitor screen, and witnessed Midoriya's MSR plan finally unfolding before all of their eyes. And the future diary didn't lie. The force of the boy's incredible power sent shockwaves crashing through each and every floor of the disused building, sending debris flying everywhere. Uraraka sent it barreling in Ida's direction and claimed the weapon. In a matter of seconds, they had won the war. But as the smoke cleared, it became apparent that Midoriya, despite his incredible efforts, hadn't managed to remain conscious to view their success. He went crashing to the floor, bloodied and bruised from head to toe, and Shoto felt his heart lodge somewhere in his throat, fear twisting his insides into knots. Somewhere outside of his vision, his hand hanging limply at his side, the red and white patterned cell displayed the words 10:53 a.m. victory. Notes. And the boys finally meet. And sheet happens. I finally got this chapter out, thanks for waiting. I know this was all quite fast-paced, so I hope this is still okay. Let me know if there are any glaring problems, and if you want, come yell at me on the Hell site. Chapter 5. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. The world was foggy and white when Izuku next opened his eyes, and all of his senses were dulled and numb. He knew he was lying down, that much was for sure, but on what he couldn't be sure of. All he knew was that it was soft and fluffy and comfortable, and that if he moved at all he might lose that. Trying to burrow deeper down into the softness below him, he felt something restricting his arm and keeping it bound in place, and so, with much difficulty, he tried to sit up so he could at least see whatever it was. Struggling to right himself, he used his other arm to wipe the sleep out of his eyes groggily, and blinking away the last remnants of fatigue, he looked at his surroundings. Golden sunlight was streaming in through the large windows and falling across almost every surface in the room, casting sharp, dark shadows anywhere its glow couldn't reach. The air was warm and still, and the room was almost completely silent, aside from the slight rustle of his bedsheets, the creak of the bed springs as he shifted his weight under the covers, and the sound of his own quiet breathing. The walls were white, there was a curtain strung up and drawn around his bed, and he realized after looking around that he was in fact inside an infirmary. With a jolt, he looked down at his right arm, and saw that he couldn't see the skin there. It had been wrapped up snugly in soft bandages, and he found that when he tried to move it, there was a dull ache rather than the typical sharp pain as he had been expecting. Rather than the agony of a fresh wound, the pain felt weeks, or even months old. It appeared that Recovery Girl had patched him up once again. Just then his thoughts were interrupted by a soft click and the sound of squeaky hinges as the door to the medical room was pushed open from the outside in. Izuku could see the dark outline of a figure through the thin divider that separated him from the rest of the room, moving around near the wall to close the door behind them. The person shuffled closer, taking hesitant steps, their form growing larger and larger with each one, and Izuku mentally prepared for the curtain to be wrenched back and, "Young Midoriya, may I come in?" That was All Might. And from the looks of his silhouette, he wasn't in his hero form, shorter, thinner, hunched over. He had come to visit him. Izuku hurried to give the man a stammered response in the affirmative, not wanting his mentor's natural appearance to be exposed should someone walk into the medical room, and All Might stepped around the divider. He looked paler and gaunter now that Izuku could properly see him, and tiredness marred his already worn countenance. He was exhausted and thoroughly overcome, but at that moment the man before him cracked a smile and nervously scratched the back of his head, his features visibly softening somewhat. "I suppose you probably don't want to see me right now, after I let it get so out of hand back there?" "No," Izuku said, shaking his head fervently and sitting up further in bed, adjusting the pillows behind him so he could be propped upright. "No, not at all. I'm not mad." "Well, that's a relief," All Might said, grabbing the chair beside his bed and scraping it out to sit across from where Izuku was positioned in bed. "I honestly thought you'd be upset that I let you get your arm broken so badly." The man's face fell slightly. "You were injured because of me, and because of my reckless attitude towards your usage of One for All. I should have given you more initial guidance, should have dash." "No," Izuku said quickly, cutting his mentor off during his speech and lowering his head, a frown making its way onto his face. "No. It wasn't your fault. If anything, I'm kind of glad you let it happen, that you let me throw the punch." His eyes looked back up and sought out All Might's, a determined expression fixed in place and a slight smile to accompany it. "I beat Kakin. If you'd stopped the match, I may never have known I was capable of that." A genuine smile broke out on his features. "And I really needed to know I was capable of that." As Toshinori watched the boy, he felt an immense sadness suddenly grip his insides. There was relief there, but sadness too. He had known Midoriya's relationship with the Bakugo boy was strained at best. That much was evident to anyone present when the two boys were anywhere near each other, but Midoriya's expression, it gave away too much in that moment, and he suddenly found himself suspecting with a sickening feeling that, perhaps, the poor boy sitting before him had been forced to deal with far more than Toshinori had initially thought. He needed to change the topic as he could feel the air beginning to grow somewhat awkward, though maybe that was just him. "Ha ha, your mother is going to kill me, isn't she?" He half joked with a sigh, knowing that, to some extent, he would actually be in trouble with said woman. He had been the supervising adult present when her son had broken his ulna, metacarpals, and radius. Midoriya's face drained of all color and he quickly looked down at his bandaged right arm, as though suddenly realizing that most mothers were never happy about seeing their child with over 3 different broken bones. She freaked out just yesterday over the finger I broke in Mr. Aizawa's class." Toshinori chuckled, possibly in an attempt to quash his growing panic, and jokingly said, "Guess I'd better start digging my grave then." Midoriya had started flapping then, exclaiming things like, "Don't say that," and "She's intense but I doubt she'd go that far." And Toshinori couldn't quite keep a fond smile from his face, the very corners of his lips tugging upwards in amusement as his protégé rambled on. The boy wasn't unhappy with him in the slightest, it seemed, and Toshinori found in that moment that he was immensely grateful for the fact that the boy had such a brave, forgiving heart. All Might departed soon after, muttering about having avoided a start-of-term teachers' conference for too long already, and that he really should get a move on if he wanted to keep his job, and Izuku was left alone in the unbelievably clean infirmary with only the silence and his own thoughts to occupy him. The day's events swam around in his brain, creating ripples almost like they were fish in water, and other memories began resurfacing in Midoriya's mind, brought up to the forefront of his imagination where he began to dwell on them in the quiet. He thought of his match with Kaken, of his opponent's enraged, desperate face and tension-lined form, and how the match had ended almost too quickly for any of them to see. He thought of the way his mother had wished him well from their doorstep that very morning, waving him goodbye from the apartment block balcony, and the way she'd told him to stay safe, call me if you need anything. How mortified she'd be when he eventually came through the door. And then he thought of times when the emotion of mortification had arisen, and immediately he thought back to the memorable conversation of that very morning and of his classmate's poor, embarrassed expression. His face immediately turned an embarrassing, blotchy shade of crimson, and despite the fact that no one was there to see him blush, he hid his discomposure anyway and buried his face in his hands, the rising memory of his ridiculous statement making him seriously begin to wonder whether he'd ever truly be able to make a good first impression on anyone. After Recovery Girl had come back from the staff meeting across campus, she had quickly examined Izuku and discharged him from her care with a slap on the wrist and a firm warning against any future reckless behavior. Slowly, he trudged down the hallway and to his homeroom where not only his cell, but all his school equipment still resided, and carefully pushed open the door to the room with his shoulder rather than his arm. "Oh, Deku!" Izuku jumped at the sound of Uraraka's loud exclamation. He hadn't expected there to still be anyone left inside the school building. He had anticipated them all going home a while ago, and so the presence of 3 of his classmates still inside their classroom shook him slightly. "Hey, it's Midoriya." Kirishima and Uraraka stood among the row of desks, and had clearly been collecting forgotten books as each had a mountain of arithmetic volumes piled up in their arms. Uraraka immediately abandoned her post and jogged to him, discarding her load, which remained exactly where she had left it, hovering about 2 feet from the ground a meter away, and engulfed him in a rib-cracking hug, scolding him for getting so terribly injured. Kirishima, too, came over, taking his own books with him and merely grinning and expressing gratitude over Izuku's speedy recovery. From over Uraraka's shoulder, he had a full view of their homeroom in the dusk sunlight, and with a jolt he realized that there was a 3rd occupant of the room that he hadn't previously noticed. Todoroki Shoto, who had been crouched on the floor when Izuku had initially entered the room, picking up stray scraps of paper, had risen to full height at the sound of a newcomer crossing the classroom's threshold, and now stood still, watching Izuku with something like apprehension on his face. Immediately remembering the shameful first introduction he'd provided the boy with earlier that morning, Izuku decided that now, if ever, was a good time to right his wrongs. He extracted his good arm from underneath Uraraka and gave his classmate an amicable wave from across the room, hoping upon hope that he'd chosen the right course of action. It appeared he had, for Todoroki gave him a tiny nod of acknowledgement and what could be considered a tiny wave in return, but was more like a mere raise of his hand, before going back to his task of picking up litter and depositing it in the wastepaper bin. After that, his classmates asked him some more about his time in the infirmary. Does it still hurt? It looked really bad earlier. Has the bruising faded? And how long until you can use it again? Before eventually telling him they were done clearing up and wishing him a safe journey home. Uraraka and Kirishima left the classroom, textbooks in tow and likely on their way to the supply room to drop them off, and Todoroki headed for the door right behind them, a black rubbish sack clutched in one hand and eyes fixed determinedly on the door. He seemed to change his mind, though, upon reaching the exit, and placed one hand on the wooden doorframe to catch himself, coming to a halt with his back to Izuku before slowly glancing over his shoulder at him. "I'm glad you're okay." And with that, he left, and Izuku was left behind in his wake, still stood in the same place and watching the point where Todoroki had just been. He shook himself, and remembered what he had come to the homeroom to do in the first place. The classroom now being empty, the room looked eerily still without the lively commotion of students and teachers moving and conversing inside. He had barely even been at Udata half a week yet, and was already growing so attached to the place. Compared to his middle school, filled with teachers that didn't believe in him, classmates that considered him a waste of space, and bullies that told him to jump from the roof as though merely making a comment on the weather that afternoon, being here was a dream come true. He shuffled over to his table and after some difficulty due to his diamante arm being out of commission, he managed to haul his school bag from the floor beside his desk onto the wooden tabletop. He had expected all of its contents to have still been inside his desk lid, but found to his utter surprise that somebody had neatly packed all of his belongings into the bag, arranging it all meticulously and precisely. He couldn't help but let a smile break out across his face at the actions of the unknown Samaritan as he swung the rucksack over his shoulder. The only thing left completely untouched by whoever had kindly packed his things away for him was his future diary. It sat in the storage area of his work table, and on top of it lay a small scrap of paper that he hadn't seen before. Curious, Izuku reached down and carefully picked it up between his fingers and peered down at the neat, immaculate handwriting. Thought you could do with a hand. Hope you don't mind. Izuku smiled. Once more. He wasn't sure what the significance of putting the small slip of paper on his cell was, but he found it endearing anyway. He slowly picked up his teal flip phone and sighed, slipped it into the inside pocket of his gray uniform and slowly made his way back out of the classroom, back down the corridor, and off school grounds, heading down the road in the evening sunset. As he walked, he tried desperately not to think of bone-crushing injuries and hugs, of small waves and nods of recognition, of red and white, and of piercing brown and blue eyes. He tried not to think of slips of small paper with written affirmations, and of the weight of the small cell phone he could feel in his pocket that if he opened right now, would show him what his soulmate was doing and what they would do for hours to come. He tried not to think of these things, he really did, but every time he so much as closed his eyes, they'd swim to the surface and invade his mind, bombarding him with unwanted thoughts and worries, threatening to drown him. Unbeknownst to him, however, a boy, lying on his bed in a far-removed room of a cold, lonely Japanese manor house, fought internally with very similar things, his hands running through his hair and his room becoming uncomfortably hot as he grappled with what to do about it all, what to say when the time came, and how to feel about the boy with fluffy hair, bright eyes and a knack for getting hurt. Notes. More Dad-mite and Todoroki for you happy face. I won't deny it, this is my favorite chapter. Great to write. Tomorrow morning me and some friends are actually going away on a 50 kilometers hike for 3 days. Remind me why we're doing this again, so there will be a gap in updates as Silver Daffy means no internet. Pray for me. As per usual, let me know if there are any glaring problems, and if you want come yell at me on the hell site. Have a good week guys. Chapter 6. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Midoriya Inko was not happy. Not in the slightest. She'd been in the kitchen cooking their dinner when she'd heard the rattle of keys in the front door and the click of the lock opening, the door swing inwards. She'd called out a cheerful greeting, welcoming her son home from another day of school, and had initially grown slightly concerned when she hadn't received a reply, but that was nothing compared to the worry that flooded over her at the sight of her only child shuffling into the kitchen, right arm fully bandaged, secured in a medical support sling, and looking utterly exhausted. She'd immediately taken the vegetables off the hob and set them to one side, running at her son and asking him what had happened. When he had told her, however, that a training exercise run by a teacher had done this to him, and that the staff member hadn't stopped him before his quirk brutally broke the bones in his arm, her maternal concern had been replaced by that of a heated anger. She had forced him into the living room and onto the settee quicker than lightning, and began pacing back and forwards in front of the television. How could they have let this happen to you? And in the first week? Mum, listen to me, Izuku pleaded as he rose from his seat on the cushions, left hand outstretched and trying to calm her, as though attempting to approach a rather frenzied lion. I mean, just look at you. She wailed, gesturing to his right arm still bound and strung up in a sling before flinging herself down onto their living room couch and cradling her head in her hands. I'm fine, look, recovery girl patched me right up, look dashed he wiggled his fingers lamely, trying to sway her worry. Look, I can move it just f-dash. That's not the point, sweetie, I'm worried about the safety measures that school has in place. Just because they're top in the country dash. Honest, Mum, it's not that bad dash, but he couldn't finish his sentence. Her head shot up immediately, her eyes fixed on a spot on the carpet, tears brimming on her lash line and more worry than he'd ever seen present in them. They'd better have secure cell phone lockers. Her eyes darkened and snapped up to meet his, and suddenly it felt as though he had been speared through this. They do, don't they? Izuku. He cast around wildly in his brain for something to say that could possibly ease her anxiety, but nothing came to mind. He'd broken his bones twice already, participated in dangerous field exercises that could have gotten him killed, and the school had no protection services for the students' future diaries, that if broken would result in a dead child. And all of this in his first 48 hours of attending the school. Izuka Midoriya, you tell me the truth right now. Not wanting to be on the other end of his mother's wrath, which was terrifying compared to her normally calm and collected manner, he gulped, having no other choice. No, they just make us put them in our desks or bags. That's it, she said, standing up abruptly, and Izuka felt his stomach drop like a stone. That's it, I'm having a word with your teacher. I'll go in tomorrow. What? No. Mum. Which teacher was in that lesson today? All Might. Mum. No, you can't. So help me, I will. Number 1 hero or not. Mum. Toshinori really had to get a grip on his time limit now that he was at risk of powering down in a room of unaware teenagers. He was lucky enough as it was that adequate trust could be placed in the faculty members to retain the secret about his true form and health complications, so he couldn't be cocky and use up his precious time when he now had an obligation to the school and a duty to fulfill as a teacher. And, of course, he didn't want to damage his health any further by needing to recklessly uphold his hero form for longer than allowed. That would be bad. I don't know why you don't just leave the hero business to after school. It's idiotic not to. Aizawa usually hurled crude remarks around, so Toshinori wasn't all that offended by it, but it did sting. He thought the man kind of had a point, actually. I know. He lamented, sighing and sinking deeper into the cushions of the staff room sofa and running his hands through his hair in frustration. But if I don't help, then who will? Other pro-heroes exist, you know? His colleague muttered, not in his mustard-yellow sleeping bag for once, but looking like he was about to nod off into the couch opposite Toshinori's all the same. Not every incident is your responsibility. I hate it when you beat me down with logic, he grumbled, shooting the man an annoyed look. I just want to help people. Don't we all? Aizawa huffed, standing from the settee and trudging over to the small kitchen area in the staff room, loading the coffee maker with water and rubbing his face with his free hand, sighing. Just don't do it again. I'm not going to cover your classes every time you dash. He was interrupted by a loud knock at the door and he groaned, putting down the pot of black coffee and moving to open it for whoever was on the other side. Wrenching it open, he was greeted by the school office secretary, looking frazzled and stressed. Ignoring Aizawa totally, allowing him to sulk off back to his coffee pot, she began to speak very quickly. All Might, there's a woman at the gates, says she's the mother of one of your students, wants to talk to you. Now, Toshinori said, incredulous. My morning class starts in 10 minutes. Yes, now, she's very insistent. Something about her son. He frowned, furrowing his brow and rubbing his chin, thinking over his options quickly. The lesson today was rather a key one, as his students would be partaking in simulations to teach them the importance of the reduction of collateral damage, and really, this parent didn't have a scheduled appointment, so he'd have to turn them down at least for now. He shook his head apologetically. I'm sorry, Nodoka, I just can't, my third year's. What do I tell her then? The woman in the doorway all but lamented. She's very persistent, All Might, said she'd demand a home visit if she couldn't be seen right now. Toshinori groaned, trying to ignore his colleague who was giving off some incredibly strong more fool you vibes from the corner of the room. Fine then, we'll do that, he said, smiling weakly at the diligent staff member by way of apologies. Which student's mother are we talking about here? Midoriya Izuku's. He's a first year, Class 1A I think. But he stopped hearing her from the moment she'd uttered the boy's surname. He knew exactly what poor Midoriya's mother wanted to discuss. And he was in deep waters with this one. From across the room, he heard Aizawa snort into his coffee at the look on Toshinori's face, and he sank down onto the sofa again, wishing it'd swallow him up. He was so screwed. Shoto usually arrived at school in the early morning. The quicker he leaves the house, the better. And when Midoriya finally arrived in the homeroom the next morning, he had been given plenty of time since the previous afternoon to mentally go over every possible scenario and outcome that could occur. He wasn't sure how he felt about the idea of this almost stranger being his soulmate, but he supposed until anything actually happened, he had no justifiable reason to outright reject anything yet. It also meant that anything could still happen, and that the situation could be crafted into one that benefited and suited him, but Shoto had roughly shoved that idea from his mind the moment it had arisen. He may not quite know what was going to happen, and it may scare him and render him speechless when Midoriya so much as made his way into his thoughts. But if there was one thing Shoto was certain of, it was that he refused to be manipulative. He refused to become anything like his father. And for that reason, he had resolved to merely let it all play out around him. He would neither immediately accept nor reject anything, he wouldn't use anything to his advantage, and he certainly wouldn't tamper with fate. That'd be like trying to swim against the current of a whitewater rapid. Dangerous, foolhardy, and a total waste of stamina. Back in the 1A classroom, his thoughtful daze was suddenly shattered by a loud thud coming from somewhere on his left, and Shoto had the sensation of abruptly falling back to earth. Slowly, he turned his head to investigate the source of the sudden jarring noise, and found a boy with curly, erratic green hair and an arm in a sling sat at his desk with his face flat against the hard wooden tabletop. The boy then began lifting his head up from the surface and bringing it down once more, slamming it over and over into the desk. Shoto usually kept to himself, but Midoriya was at risk of giving himself a horrible bruise on his forehead if left to continue, and Shoto couldn't simply sit by and let the boy accumulate more injuries. He cautiously reached out a hand to stop him, unsure of whether or not he should intervene at all. Midoriya? Are you dash? But he jerked his hand back out of shock when the boy's face appeared out from underneath his mass of green curls. He turned his head against the table to face Shoto's own, his left cheek still pressed firmly against the hard wooden desk's surface and his hair falling in his face, causing him to occasionally heave out a puff of air to blow it away. He smiled at Shoto sadly, clearly torn between frustration at something and the longing to appear outwardly fine. Sorry, Todoroki. I didn't mean to startle you. The cogs in Shoto's brain immediately began whirring. Midoriya hadn't asked a direct question that required a simple answer, meaning he'd have to come up with a meaningful way to respond, and Shoto didn't want to lie to Midoriya and say that he hadn't startled him, because he had, but being so upfront may also be inconsiderate. God, this socialization thing was difficult. He settled for a mere statement of recognition, but one that would hopefully ease the boy's mind if possible, and so Shoto said a quiet, no, it's fine, before relaxing back into his chair a little with the fresh knowledge that Midoriya didn't appear to be in any rush to resume maiming his own forehead again. He then received a small smile from his classmate, and his stomach did a backflip. Forget the fact that he had no idea how to respond to a nonverbal social cue. Midoriya's smile was like the FING sun. Sorry, Todoroki dashed. His thought process was once more interrupted by the boy before him. It's just my mum. Oh, he began, unsure whether that was an acceptable response to the statement but slowly beginning to realize that perhaps he didn't need to read into every little detail so deeply. The conversation seemed to, oddly enough, be holding up somehow. How so? Well, you saw, but I broke my arm yesterday, didn't I? And my mum was livid. The boy lamented, his face, still squished up against the desk, becoming crestfallen and reddening with embarrassment. She marched all the way up here and demanded a meeting with All Might to discuss school safety surrounding future diaries, or something. And Midoriya kept talking. He talked about his mother's antics and the way she had shouted through the speaker by the school gate in front of a crowd of the public, leaving him standing stock still in mortification and horror. Shoto supplied a brief nod and a comment on the fact that people may have found it rather comical instead, and that he ought not to fret over it. He spoke of the way he was worried All Might would be in trouble over the whole thing, and the way he feared there'd be repercussions for the pro-hero despite the fact that he'd been the one foolish enough to throw the bone-breaking punch. Shoto provided what he hoped had been reassurance on the fact that All Might was a trained, professional adult in the working world and that he'd be able to handle it all just fine by himself. And Midoriya talked and talked and talked, and it seemed all he wanted in return was someone to give him their time and to occasionally show him they were still tuned in. And Shoto was fine to sit with people if they gave him the opportunity not to have to worry about how he'd act and what he'd say. And Midoriya was giving him that chance, it seemed. He hadn't come to school expecting to make any friends, barely even acquaintances, but he found that, strangely, it didn't perturb him that it seemed to be happening anyway. So when Midoriya asked him if he was bothering Shoto in any way, he merely shook his head no, reassuring his classmate that he wasn't in any way burdening him, and indicating for him to continue speaking as he wished. Notes. I've returned from the wilderness, soul officially crushed. I've read some comments since returning and they were all so amazing. I love you guys, you're all so sweet. I'm sorry that I didn't get to reply at the time, I'll be right back on track with that soon hopefully. And also RIP All Might 2K17, Inko's coming for you, old man. Thank you all so much for your unwavering love and support. Kudos or a comment if you enjoyed / if you see any issues, and if you want, come yell at me on the hell site. Chapter 7. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Shoto. The boy froze on the spot at the sound of his own name being hissed out in venomous tones, his fists still raised and sweat beading across his brow. He breathed out forcefully through his nose in frustration and slowly dropped his offensive manner, defenses going up immediately. He settled for merely pausing and waiting for his father to continue speaking as he went to grab his towel, knowing it'd piss him off. Snatching up the material from the floor, he mopped at his forehead and slung it over one shoulder, dusted off his hands, and waited. Shoto, look at me. At those words, his confidence wavered. The man sounded livid, and Shoto didn't like the idea of hobbling into school tomorrow. Since when had this man had so much power over him? Since the very beginning, evidently. Shoto turned where he stood and avoided eye contact with his father until he heard loud, purposeful footsteps approaching where he stood. His eyes flicked up immediately and he almost took a step away from the man, but he held his ground, face passive and stance neutral. Your fighting is mediocre at best and your concentration is lackluster. Your mind is focused elsewhere. It wasn't a question, it was a statement that had been hurled and spat in his direction with more venom than a python. Villains won't wait for you to gather your thoughts. He snarled, upper lip curling. Whatever else you're thinking of, the man before him said, turning away and tugging his fighting gloves off, irritation very evident. Erase it. I simply won't tolerate any disobedience. Shoto's face had darkened a while ago, and his fists were balled at his side, frost slowly creeping up his skin and his knuckles taut and white. His expression flickered for a moment between anger and anguish before he managed to get a hold of his emotions and his face reverted back to one of neutrality. Yes, sir. He forced out through gritted teeth, knowing that swallowing his pride would be far less taxing on him, physically, if not mentally, than creating conflict with the flame hero. He knew the sparring session was over from the pro's dismissal, and so he turned on his heels and snatched up his water bottle, hastily vacating the training hall he loathed so much and making a beeline for his room. Fuyumi had called out to him when she noticed him storming past the kitchen, visibly rattled, but her words had fallen on deaf ears. When Endeavor next walked past his youngest son's bedroom, the door slightly ajar, he saw the boy lying on his bed clutching his stupid little future diary as he stared at its screen, and his eyes narrowed, his BLD boiling on the spot. If this continued, he'd see to it himself that that thing didn't get in his son's way. And remember, I want that essay in next Tuesday. Aizawa called over the noise of 20 scraping chairs and rustling bags, his voice reaching a crescendo in an attempt to drill it into their skulls that he refused to deal with any homework bullshit from the year group's top class. I mean it, Kaminari - the blonde boy winced, and Aizawa turned to Midoriya amongst the class, his facial expression bordering on despair. And please stick to the maximum word limit, Midoriya. 1,500 words only. Why is sir? Sorry, sir. Izuku yelped before hastily SWing his bag over his shoulder and bolting for the door. He skidded to a halt just before reaching it, however, and glanced back at the remaining people in the room, his eyes finding the red and white mop of hair that belonged to Todoroki Shoto. In an effort to make friends at his new school, Izuku was determined not to repeat the events of the first 13 years of his life. He had tried to talk to as many of his new classmates as possible. Some, he had found, were simply not his kind of people, like Mineta and Aoyama, though he found he could uphold decent conversation with everyone he had classes with, and some, he was delighted to discover, actually liked him for some reason. Or at least tolerated him, perhaps, which was still miles better than the treatment he'd received from Kaken all his life. Todoroki was packing up slowly compared to everyone else, who were all determined to get near the front of Lunch Rush's food line, and seemed to be perfectly happy in his own company, but Izuku made a split-second decision and called out to the boy. "Hey Todoroki, wanna join us for lunch?" The boy had initially looked up at him at the sound of his name being called, but then looked down at his toes, seemingly trying to decide how to respond. It had been obvious to Izuku the moment he had first interacted with him that here was a boy who had very little social experience at all. Waiting patiently for an answer, Izuku gave Todoroki a large smile in the hopes that it'd quash any qualms he had about dining with him, and to his delight, Todoroki, whose shoulders Midoriya hadn't realized were tense until they lowered and relaxed, seemed to loosen up. He replied with a quick okay, and hurried to pack up the rest of his bag before jogging to catch up with his classmate on the way to lunch. From inside his mustard-yellow sleeping bag, still sat on the floor behind the teacher's podium, Aizawa rolled his eyes with a scoff and flopped over so he was lying down. Teenagers. So uncoordinated. Shoto hadn't expected there to be so many people at Midoriya's lunch table. Around half their class, give or take a few, were seated there, already chatting raucously and eating together, and Shoto stood stock still off to one side, tray with his own food clutched tightly in his hands and dread rapidly accumulating in the pit of his stomach. No, not dreads, he was beginning to panic. Todoroki? Midoriya stood not far from him, his own tray still held in his hands and a concerned expression plastered across his face as he studied Shoto's countenance. He had picked up on his discomfort. "Sorry, Midoriya." Shoto mumbled abruptly, turning away from the group at the table and putting all his focus on controlling his breathing. "Perhaps another time." "Okay, hang on, sorry guys, tomorrow for sure," he heard the boy say from somewhere in the background, accompanied by some kind of cluttering and shuffling around. Midoriya then walked out from behind him, past where he was stood and to another table further away from the one full of their classmates in a much quieter part of the hall. More importantly, it was empty. A calmer atmosphere. He placed his tray down on its clean, white surface and walked back over to Shoto hesitantly, looking almost sheepish, no, apologetic. "I'm sorry, that was really insensitive of me." Midoriya began, and then cracked a small smile, making Shoto's stomach do a weird sort of jolt. "But maybe, you still wouldn't mind eating with me?" Shoto was thoroughly intrigued as to what was motivating this boy to converse with him so much, but he nodded all the same and shuffled over to the table with his classmate, and by the time he reached it, he had his breathing under wraps. For the most part over the lunch PRD, Midoriya simply talked again, allowing Shoto to listen. He was explaining his personal list of favorite heroes, and where most people simply referred to the official rankings, Shoto noted that Midoriya had clearly thought long and hard about it, with some more retro and up-and-coming heroes making it quite far up the list. Of course, of all the heroes, All Might took the #1 spot, but he noticed with a kind of twisted satisfaction that Endeavor the Flame hero was nowhere to be seen among them. "Ah, Edgeshot too," Midoriya began after swallowing a particularly large mouthful of mixed vegetables. "Did you know that thanks to years of training, he can transform his body at the speed of sound?" "I mean." Shoto looked up from his meal and met Midoriya's eyes, and in that moment, though perhaps it was a trick of the light, they seemed to shine. "How cool is that?" "Very," he supplied, permitting a smile to cross onto his face at his classmate's sheer eagerness. His smile fell, however, when he looked down into the bottom of his bowl and saw his own face in the reflection of the stalk still sitting there. It looked distorted by the slight movement of the table as they ate. Grotesque. "Midoriya?" "Uh-huh." The boy responded through another large helping of his food, his head tilting slightly to one side in curiosity. "Why?" Shoto caught himself and rephrased what he was going to say, for fear of sounding rude. "Not that I dislike it, but why are you trying to make my acquaintance?" The fluffy-haired boy's eyes widened at that, and he set down his chopsticks beside his plate, fiddling with his hands. It seemed to be a habit of his. "Because," he looked up at Shoto, "because I know what it's like to not have any friends, and to feel like an outsider," and he seemed to be struggling to find the words to say. "And no one should have to feel like that." And at those words, in his mind, suddenly Shoto was 7 again, and being dragged away from his siblings and their friends, forced into training he did not want to undertake. He was sitting at the edge of their garden pond with only the koi fish and carp to keep him company, and even then, they'd swim away from him the moment he so much as touched the water they resided in. And he was curled up on his bed in the darkness of one gloomy winter evening, the artificial blue light of his red and white patterned flip phone the only thing illuminating his face as he clung onto its each and every word. His soulmate had been one of his only comforting presences as he grew up, had somehow felt there even in his darkest moments, and had been a constant in his messy, unpredictable childhood. He had cared for, envied, worried over and cherished his soulmate where he could for no one else, and Shoto realized that perhaps his soulmate had been one of the only things keeping him sane back then. And here they sat, in the flesh, right in front of him after all those years. It suddenly occurred to him that this boy, Midoriya Izu, had been his only friend for longer than either of them knew. It was a strange feeling, having the sensation that you had known someone all your life when in reality you had only just met. It really was quite remarkable, knowing that the boy before him liked ice cream and chicken katsu curry even though today was the first time they had eaten together, that his journey home from middle school had taken half an hour every day despite the fact that Shoto had never seen the boy's house nor middle school, and that he had been constantly littered with bruises, burns and blemishes throughout his childhood even though they had never exchanged more than pleasantries. He knew that Midoriya was strong and courageous and healed quickly and could topple mountains, knew that he was observant and thoughtful and saw the little things like phone charms and spare change on the side of the road, and he knew that before him sat the boy he knew like the back of his hand, and probably knew him just as well too. Though he probably didn't even realize it yet. Shoto abruptly remembered that he had asked Midoriya a question earlier and shouldn't leave him hanging, and so nodded and did his utmost to provide his classmate with a smile by way of thanks, and the boy's face instantly brightened at the sight of it. Almost blindingly so. After that, Midoriya continued talking about his favorite heroes, mentioning the Buster hero, Air Jet, and sidekick Centipede as two he was particularly fond of, and Shoto leant back in his seat once more, content to carry on listening to his ramblings. He had previously been uncomfortable and thrown by the idea of someone he had just met being his soulmate, and by the fact that all his life he had been told by his father that soulmates were just another obstacle on the path to the top. Sitting in the lunch hall with Midoriya, however, where the atmosphere was calm and they were relaxed in each other's company, it wasn't at all like what he'd been told. It was like what he'd seen, and he realized that now. He'd seen the way his sister held her flip phone close to her sister and treasured it in her heart, the way Fuyumi had spoken of her own soulmate with a fondness more adoring than anything he'd ever seen before, and in the way she'd put her own safety on the line in order to reunite Shoto with his future diary all those years ago, because it just isn't right that he's kept it from you for so long. Her words echoed around in his head once more, and he made a mental note to thank her for giving him his soulmate, for granting him his closest companion, and for providing him with support and comfort. If it wasn't for her, he didn't think his sanity would have remained intact for this long. Later on that evening, Midoriya Izu, having waved a friendly goodbye to Todoroki at the school gates and returned home to complete his assignment, would be in his room typing away on his laptop when he would see his teal flip phone out of the corner of his eye, pick it up, and take note of the words, "Express gratitude for sister's actions" on screen, his expression softening. Notes. And things start slotting into place at last. Aive waited so long for the boys to reach this point. Now let the character relationship development begin. No, but seriously, posting this chapter was super nerve-wracking. No wonder it's like quarter to midnight, I'm stalling, 'cause some super key character development occurs. But man, am I hyped to write from now on. Good things to come hopefully. Thank you all so much for reading and for your wonderful comments. I may not be able to reply to them all, but I try my best in between commitments. Drop a kudos or a comment if you enjoyed / if you see any issues, and if you want, come yell at me on the hell site. Chapter 8. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Over the course of the next few weeks, as the cherry trees began to finally lose their last petals and the sun grew hotter and hotter by the day, Midoriya invited more and more people to sit with him and Todoroki at their virtually empty lunch table. It started small with the ever-kind Yaoyorozu approaching them, tray in hand, and asking apprehensively if she'd be permitted to join them. Midoriya had beamed another one of his radiant, breath-catching smiles. Shoto really had to get a hold of himself, and from then on, she sat with them at most meals. It also seemed that, at some point, Jiru had had enough of eating near Mineta, who would make crude jokes and idiotic remarks while people ate, and so at some point she just, sort of, integrated into their small group. Shoto didn't know exactly when it had occurred, it just happened, and curiously, he found he didn't mind. Both girls were nice enough, anyway, and mostly talked among themselves. A few more followed suit, whether because of the strange pull Midoriya had on people or for other reasons he wasn't sure, but eventually, Shoto found himself slightly more comfortable around other people. He still hadn't quite grasped how to properly converse directly with them, but he'd been lucky so far. Most people seemed aware of his quiet nature, and so didn't often address him individually. The only one who did was Midoriya, but Shoto found he didn't mind that so much either. In fact, he was quite comfortable with how things were progressing, and he was possibly even feeling a little happier for it, until Kaminari's loud voice rang out across the 1A homeroom one Friday afternoon, cutting off Shoto's conversation with Midoriya and Uraraka so he could announce a gathering at the park around the corner the following day. Everyone's invited, 'cause we need some quality class bonding time. He shouted, aiming a thwack with his textbook at Ciro's head for yelling, "Don't forget your knitting, dears," immediately after. The squabbling pair sat down, and the talk in the room derailed since the broadcast, such to discussions about Saturday's events. Unlike everyone else, who all seemed to be laughing and excited at the prospect of a class outing, Shoto paled at the thought. He'd only recently gotten used to sitting with barely 7 people at lunch, let alone his entire class for a day out. "Hey!" Shoto felt a gentle hand make its way onto his shoulder and he turned to its owner, finding himself staring at Midoriya. "You don't have to go yet? Don't force yourself if you really don't want to." Shoto looked down at his hands and kept his face as neutral as possible, fingers laced together and neatly placed in his lap, and for a moment he was glad that Uraraka was such an understanding person. She hadn't commented on his very obvious dilemma, and merely sat unassumingly off to one side, patiently waiting for their conversation to resume with a smile on her face. He decided to weigh up the options. If he even managed to get away from his father's clutches in the first place, Saturday was training day, then he'd be spending his time doing something that was, in theory, far more enjoyable than avoiding being beaten up by the world's number 2 hero. The people in his class were also not as intimidating as he had first guessed. Yaoyorozu was kind and placid, Jiru was laid back and relaxed, Uraraka and Ida, despite both of their loud, outgoing personalities, were amicable and charming, and of course there was Midoriya too, who he spent most of his time at school with now. It wasn't like he'd be forced to sit with people he wasn't accustomed to yet, anyway. Slowly, he raised his head again and looked at his friend, whose hand was still on his shoulder. At the small nod and tiny smile he gave the boy, however, Midoriya lowered his hand and flashed another grin his way as Present Mike entered the room alongside a booming chorus of "Who's ready to crush three-dimensional trigonometry?" It became apparent the following day that Kaminari and Ciro managed to pick the perfect day for a park gathering. As Shoto slipped on his sneakers, careful not to make a noise lest he anger his father any more than he already had, he checked and double-checked that he had everything he would possibly need either on him or in his rucksack. His phone, future diary, keys, travel pass, wallet and book, lest he become bored, were all safely packed away, and so he rose to his feet, preparing to open the front door to leave. Shoto? He glanced over his shoulder at the sound of his name being called and saw his elder sister stood apprehensively by the top of the Genkin porch, a mixture of curiosity and worry lining her features and evident in her posture. "Where are you going?" And then, more urgently, "You're not sneaking out, are you?" He shook his head and placed a hand on the door again, pushing it open. "There's a class lunch in Mizudafu Central Park." Her face immediately brightened and her shoulders relaxed as a sigh of relief left her. "Ah, I see." A pause and then, "It's good to see you've made some friends." He wasn't sure what it had been about her statement that had struck a chord in him, but he felt his heart jolt when she said it, and not in a bad way either. Fidgeting with one of the belt loops on his jeans absent-mindedly, he felt a strange warmth blossom in his city that he was certain wasn't coming from his oh-so-despised left side. He gave her one last nod, this time accompanied by one of his trademark almost smiles, and stepped outside into the bright, late spring sun. "Deku, over here." Walking across the freshly cut lawn of the park, Izuku had to shield his eyes from the blazing sun in order to see where the call had come from. Spotting a group of around 10 people all sat on picnic rugs or lying on the grass near a pond, he waved back jovially and jogged over to them. Catching sight of Uraraka and Ida settled on the lawn with their backs to the sun. Heading over, more recognizable faces came into view, all laughing and smiling, with the exception of a rather put-out-looking Bakugo. "Hey guys," he chirped, dropping his bag on the grass opposite them and seating himself cross-legged, hands in his lap touching the earth. "How long have you all been here?" "Well, I was the first person here since my apartment is just around the corner," Uraraka supplied, glancing around the rest of group with a hand sheltering her eyes from the daylight in order to see their faces. She pointed to each person in turn as she spoke. Bakugo turned up not long after that, and Kirishima came 2 seconds later, thank God, and from there people have just been filtering in. She turned back to him again, a smile emblazoned across her features. "You look great. I love the shirt. Everyone looks so different in their own clothes." "Yes, indeed," Ida agreed fervently, straightening his glasses which seemed to glint in the sunlight. "Each person's style really gives a better impression on the type of person they are." This was an excellent idea on Kaminari's part. He wore a smart white shirt with a neutral brown jumper over top of it. "How are you not boiling?" Uraraka exclaimed, tugging and prodding at the knitwear. "It's almost 20 degrees outside." Izuku let the friendly conversation wash over him for a blissful moment. The group was so cheerful and animated amongst each other. Tsuyu, Ashido and Hagakure sat beside the small pond dipping their toes in, or in Tsuyu's case, swimming in it. Kaminari, Yaoyorozu and Jair were laughing at something on the boy's phone, and Shiro and Kirishima were goofing off around Bakugo. They clearly had a death wish. He had just been browsing his phone thanks to a notification from his newsfeed app. There had apparently been a high-scale bank robbery attempt in the downtown area, far-flung from this area of the city, when a shadow appeared on the grass in front of him as something covered the sun briefly. Looking up, he saw what or who had caused the sudden darkness. Positioned behind both of the people sat opposite him stood the boy with two-toned hair and dual-colored eyes from their class. Uraraka had twisted around to greet him, smiling and chatting brightly with Ida at her side, also giving his salutations, and Izuku barely caught even a snippet of what either of them were saying. The boy was wearing a red checkered flannel overshirt with a baggy gray tee beneath it. He had donned a pair of fitted blue jeans with rips at the knees and black sneakers, and he was distracting. The sun behind him seemed to create the illusion that he was adorned with some sort of radiant, sunlit halo, and Izuku was having difficulty tearing his eyes away. "Hello, Midoriya." "Sheet," I was staring again. He gulped, fixing his posture nervously. "Hi, Todoroki. Glad you could make it." The boy nodded in reply, and after being instructed to do so by Ida, he picked his way between their things on the lawn and carefully seated himself beside Izuku, setting his rucksack off to one side and settling down, creating a sort of circle consisting of the four of them. Idle conversation started back up, this time with the quiet addition of Todoroki, and at some point into the afternoon, Uraraka pulled out packets of mochi and dorayaki. "I stopped off at the convenience store on my way here," she said, grinning happily. "It's on me. Pass it around." When the packets came around to Izuku, he took some of each, shooting his thanks to Uraraka briefly, before handing the snacks off to Todoroki. As he took them from him, he said something that Izuku almost didn't catch over Bakugo's screech of bloodlust a few meters away. "I like your shirt. It suits you." His mind went blank. Todoroki just complimented him. Thank you," he stammered, tugging on the hem of said garment. It was white with a black grid design on it. "I've had it a while. The cardigan too, actually," he explained, gesturing to his light green pullover, scratching his cheek sheepishly. "I don't go shopping all that often." "Ah, I see. Well, I still like it. My sister and I usually go together whenever we need anything." "Ah, well, you both clearly have good style." I like your outfit too. Thank you, Midoriya. It's nothing. From far off, Kirishima's yell could be heard, and he and Todoroki turned to see him waving frantically at the people still near the pond, frisbee in hand. Hey you guys, get on over here. Bakugo reckons he can decimate everyone, but I say otherwise. Hey dash. From opposite, Izuku heard a low cackle and turned to find Uraraka scrambling to her feet, a look of terrifying determination fixed in place. Oh, I am going to destroy this, just you wait. Midoriya Inko was restless. Right after her son had left that morning to go out with his classmates, and how elated she'd been to hear the word friends escape his lips with no trace of doubt on his face, she'd received a call from an unknown number on their landline. Picking up the phone, she'd answered with a curious, hello? Midoriya Inko speaking, only to be informed that the pro-hero All Might had been scheduled in for a home visit to their tiny, two-bedroom apartment as per her request not even a week ago. She's really gone and shot herself in the foot this time. In nervous anticipation of what was to come, she'd cleaned the house from top to bottom, sorted and rearranged all of the food in their fridge, and even had a shower out of anxious trepidation. The house hadn't played host to guests in years, not since Mr. and Mrs. Bakugo last visited in Izuku's early childhood and when neighbors would occasionally pop round to check on her right after Hisashi suddenly disappeared. In short, it was safe to say that she was immensely out of practice. When the doorbell finally rang at 3:27, piercing the eerie quiet that lay thick over every room with its shrill chimes, she jumped about a foot in the air above the sofa before scrambling down the hallway, fixing her hair and straightening her skirt as she went. After placing two hands on the door, she peered through the peephole to check that the call hadn't been a figment of her imagination. But no, there All Might stood, dressed in a bold yellow pinstripe suit and blue tie that had clearly been tailor-fitted to his huge frame. He was so tall that his head was completely obscured from her limited field of view, and she stepped back from the door, pausing for a moment to mentally prepare herself before opening up to the visitor. The hinges squeaked slightly, and she made an immediate mental note to oil them at some point. Hello, Mrs. Midoriya. The pro-hero boomed, his trademark smile in place and a bow offered her way. I assume you received the school's phone call then? Why yes I did. Thank you. No, the pleasure's all mine. I apologize for being slightly tardy, there was an incident downtown that all the big heroes were called to. But anyway dash. He said, and as he withdrew his arms from behind his back, she spotted a bouquet of flowers clutched in his hands. All of a sudden he seemed sheepish, and he idly scratched his cheek with one finger. I bought these for you, I hope you don't mind. No, they're lovely, she said, tenderly taking them from his hands and taking in a breath of their gorgeous scent. The bundle consisted of blue hyacinths and white tulips, and they truly made for a sublime combination when paired together as they had been in this particular bouquet. Thank you, All Might, they really are gorgeous. I'm glad to hear it. Inko noticed that some of the people living in the other apartments on their floor had begun to peer out of windows and front doors at the sight of the most famous hero in the country being on her doorstep, muttering and whispering excitedly. Aya, why don't you come on in? I have the air conditioning on so it'll be a lot cooler in here. Her visitor squeezed his way through the front door and removed his shoes at their genkin, being careful not to knock over pieces of furniture and breakables. Leading the way down the hallway, she paused at the entrance to their combined kitchen and lounge area to look back at the hero, shuffling down the corridor in her home and suddenly looking rather endearingly out of place, given his size. She could tell this meeting was going to be interesting. Notes. Curse thee, writer's block. Begone. Please? Ah well, all that matters is that I got this up in time, I guess? But anyway, I enjoyed writing this chapter so much. It's also the longest chapter so far, so I spoiled you guys a bit. But bonding moments, am I right? I'm so weak for that sheet and it shows. Thank you all again for the wonderful comments you all leave. They literally make my day when I see new ones. I look forward to them every time I update. Anywho, drop a kudos or a comment if you enjoyed / if you see any issues, and if you want, come yell at me on the hell site. Chapter 9. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. When Toshinori saw the address of the house he'd been assigned to visit, he'd known immediately that it wouldn't be the biggest, grandest homestead in Japan. Far from it, actually. The district was known across Mizuta City as one of the most run-down, underfunded areas in town, with possibly one of the highest crime rates too, and he couldn't believe he hadn't known where his protégé lived before now. His spirits sank upon spotting the right tower block. A few words sprung to mind: bleak, crumbling, cramped. But when the door to the Midoriya household had opened, revealing a middle-aged woman whose smile made his stomach jolt and his breath leave him, all his previous assumptions vanished on the spot. The house may have indeed been cramped, but for heaven's sake he was over 7 foot tall. All houses are cramped for him, but it was warm, comfortable, lived in, and homely. It also became very obvious to him standing on their doorstep that Midoriya Izuku had inherited his radiant smile from the woman who had shyly greeted him from her porch. And boy, was her smile gorgeous. He saw it numerous times. First, as she accepted his flower bouquet gift, then as she let him into her home, and out of the corner of his eye as he struggled to put on the guest's slippers by the Genkan, her eyes soft and face kind. "I'd better put these in a vase, they really are wonderful. Hyacinths are my favorite flowers, actually. The petals are always so full of color and the fragrance is delightful." All of a sudden, All Might knew exactly where Izuku's rambling habit had come from. "If you go and head on over to the sofa, I'll be right through in a second. I just need to get that vase." As he shuffled over to the small couch, he could have sworn he'd caught a brief "All Might in my house," and "if only Izuku were here," and he chuckled, being extra careful not to do any damage to the furniture while taking a seat. He glanced around the room as he waited, taking in his surroundings to further understand the kind of household he was visiting. This was his first requested home visit as a teacher, and no doubt there'd be more. He already had another one scheduled for just under a month's time because a third-year's parent wanted assurance that the hero career would be safe for her son. He was not looking forward to that one. Either way, Aizawa and Nedzu had both given him similar advice: stay polite, be professional, and get a vague feel for the parents' attitudes. Picture frames, though few and far between, sat on the television stand and atop the shelves lining the walls, and Toshinori peered at them one by one. Photos of a much younger Midoriya Izuku met his eyes, those very same emerald green eyes staring back at him, carbon copies of the ones he saw almost 5 days a week. They remained unchanged, and he seemed just as kind and excitable a decade ago as he did only yesterday. Midoriya Inko had changed a lot since those photographs had been taken evidently, though oddly it wasn't the differences in her appearance that jumped out at him. No, most people changed in looks after 10 years. It was the way the woman held herself in the pictures that made his brow crease slightly. A decade ago, Midoriya Inko had looked tired. He guessed that the majority of the photos had been taken sometime before Izuku's diagnosis as quirkless, as the boy still looked so full of life and happiness. So perhaps there had been something else before then that Izuku hadn't been old enough to quite comprehend? Toshinori wasn't entirely sure. At that moment, Midoriya Inko came out of the small apartment kitchen carrying a tray in her arms laden with cups, the vase placed elegantly in the middle. He rose slightly from the cushioned seat to assist her, but she shook her head, smiling again and setting it down on the wooden coffee table. The flowers took center stage, deposited delicately on the tabletop and followed by ceramic mugs filled with steaming hot tea. "Thank you, Mrs. Midoriya. You are very kind." "Oh, it's not a problem," she gushed nervously, waving her hands to and fro as she spoke. "Not a problem at all. I hope it isn't too hot." No, it's perfect, thank you," he said, taking another blissful sip before jolting back down to earth at the sight of the woman across from him lacing her fingers together in her lap, her brows furrowed. He wasn't here for a jovial chat. He was here to discuss the reason behind her son's severe injuries, most likely. "Mr. All Might — she began, eyes rising to meet his own, full of emotions Toshinori couldn't quite distinguish. "I'd like to know why you let my son break 3 bones in his right arm while under your adult supervision." He gulped. He'd been expecting the question for weeks now, and had thought that maybe he'd effectively braced himself for it, but apparently not. The words were painful to hear and made guilt pool in the pit of his stomach. "Mrs. Midoriya, I can assure you that it is not something I am proud of, nor something that I wish for your son to go through again," he said, setting the ceramic cup down on the table. "I take full responsibility for what happened. Yes, Yes, I'd expect no less, she said huffily, waving one hand slightly in dismissal. What I want to know is what happened, why it happened, and whether or not you plan on continuing to sit by while my son's bones are repeatedly broken. Her bravery in the face of the #1 hero certainly was admirable, he thought. It had been a very long while since someone had challenged him with such confidence. It was a refreshing change. During the training exercise, I had been supervising the children while they experienced the types of situations they'd face if they entered into the hero career. He explained. Your son had been on the hero team, fighting and villain dash. He encased the word in quotation marks to outline that real villains hadn't been involved. And that opponent happened to be Bakugo Katsuki. He saw the woman's face change from a look of concentration to silent horror in an instant, and it became obvious that young Midoriya hadn't disclosed this information to his mother, and that, too, Katsuki Bakugo apparently had a history with the Midoriyas. She had recognized the name immediately. The pairs were decided through lots, and they just happened to have been pitted against one another. The harried mother slumped back into the cushions of her armchair, running a stressed hand through her long, green hair. Well, I guess it couldn't have been helped. Indeed, he said, nodding gravely. They were both very determined, pull through triumphant, and I had noticed previously that they weren't on good terms at all. He bowed his head then, thinking back to the fire he'd seen in Izuku's eyes, and sighed. Forgive me, Mrs. Midoriya, if my judgment was not correct he went on, well aware that he sounded very solemn all of a sudden, but it became apparent to me in that moment that your son really needed to know he could emerge from the battle victorious. A silence filled the room, swirling and palpable as the woman before him seemed to take in all that he'd told her. Katsuki has always hated Izuku for reasons I could never quite fathom. She lamented, more to herself than anyone else, and when she next spoke it was to his horror that her voice began to crack, head hung in her hands. I'd hoped it would all stop by high school. Mrs. Midoriya? He tried, almost rising from his seat to aid her before she sat up straight again, face set and resolute, not a trace of the anguish shed just displayed present. But why am I saying all of this to Japan's top hero? She chuckled, subtly wiping at the corner of her eye, and Toshinori found his respect for her deepening tenfold. Forget his physical prowess, in terms of emotional strength and perseverance, she far outdid him in every aspect possible. That same intense, unreadable expression reappeared on her face once more, and she seemed ready to take on the world. I still want to know why his bones broke. It was a miracle his quirk finally manifested, truly a gift, but it has been so sudden I still don't understand it. He shifted uncomfortably, the knowledge that he'd concealed the true nature of her son's quirk weighing down upon him, and he began slowly. Your son's quirk was registered as strength augmentation, no? And she nodded. Well, unlike his classmates, his body hasn't had the time usually given to grow and adapt along with his quirk. The immense power it lends him also puts a lot of strain and pressure on his body, meaning he sustains injuries as a side effect? I see. We are working on it hurriedly at the sight of her face falling. My colleagues and I are working with him to try and minimize the damage he receives from his quirk. I can assure you he is in the best hands. Nodding, she supplied him with the briefest of smiles before speaking again, her face darkening. I have one final question, she said, and suddenly Toshinori knew what the emotion he'd seen in her eyes earlier had been, anxiety-driven anger, and it was showing through in full force at that moment. Anger that was, undoubtedly, aimed at him for a very good reason, however uncomfortable it made him feel. He looks up to you, All Might, always has, you're the reason he wanted to be on the hero course so badly, and while I respect his wishes and admire his drive, her face was resolute. I refuse to let him pursue his dream at a school with such foolhardy, lackluster security measures. Mrs. Midoriya he began, attempting to keep his tone as pacifying as possible, perplexed. I don't quite understand Their future diaries, for goodness sake. Izuku tells me that the students aren't supplied with safe places to keep them during the day. What if a pupil took one onto the field and it broke? What if someone's went missing? And at her finishing words, he truly felt a mother's wrath. If my son's cell gets stolen on your grounds, If he's bullied and threatened with his life because your staff didn't properly protect him she drew in a slow, unsteady breath. I will never forgive you. A gut-wrenching pain that was entirely unrelated to the wound in his side took hold of his stomach, and he felt totally and utterly powerless. I. He stuttered, and though he was in his hero form, he was small and weak and useless before her. I want your word, All Might. Midoriya Inko rose from her armchair ominously, hands balled up by her sides and fire dancing in her eyes, and in that moment, despite her small stature, she seemed to fill the entire room with her presence. He's my only child and he's all that I've got. I want your word that you will fix this issue and start safeguarding your students from harm. His impression of Midoriya Inko had drastically changed over the last hour. She was kind and timid, emotional and compassionate, and so very, very strong, all at once, and he found he couldn't help but admire the mother before him that he'd only just met. After all the pain and anguish he'd no doubt put her through, how could he possibly let her down now? Of course, he said, meeting her gaze evenly with unwavering resolve, trying to convey that he was a man of his word. I promise, Mrs. Midoriya. Her face seemed to soften, those gorgeous green eyes crinkling around the edges as a small approving smile somehow made its way onto her countenance. She leant over the coffee table between them and extended one palm out for him to shake, and taking care not to overdo it on his strength, he grasped her small hand in his own comically large one, shaking firmly. She had a strong grip too. Now, enough of this depressing discussion, she said, suddenly businesslike. I want that scene too, All Might, but for now would you like some more tea? I have chamomile. Izuku also bought red bean taiyaki yesterday. Would you like some? Thank you, Mrs. Midoriya. That would indeed be lovely. Pardon me, Midoriya, but is this not your stop? Izuku, who had been in a world of his own reading news articles on his phone, snapped his head up to stare at the two people accompanying him, Ida looking concerned and Todoroki wedged between them nodding his head. What? He quickly glanced out of the bus window beside him and realized with a jolt to the stomach that Ida was indeed right. The familiar scenery outside was rushing past, getting slower and slower as they got closer and closer to his destination. Oh, see! He yelped, scrambling to grab his bag and stand up without falling over, but thanks to the bus swaying and jostling along the uneven, pothole-ridden road, it proved to be quite a challenge. Shuffling past his friends and almost tumbling on top of Todoroki when the bus went over a speed bump, he made his way down the aisle to the exit of the vehicle and waited for the automatic doors to open, bouncing on the ball of his feet and smiling back at his classmates, who each waved in return or offered him small smiles of their own. As the panels slid open, he chirped a quick "Bye, guys. Thanks for everything," before stepping out onto the pavement and looking back at the seat where they had been sitting. Todoroki had shuffled over to the window seat to look out at the neighborhood, and catching his eye, Izuku beamed, waved and watched as his friend's face retreated from view along with the bus. When it rounded the corner, he turned on his heel and trotted back to his apartment building, enjoying the afternoon sun still beating down on his shoulders. Upon reaching his front door, he tried the doorknob and found it to be open. No doubt his mum was still home, and entered the house, undoing the laces on his shoes and humming a random tune. He had just been about to call out a quick "Hey mum, I'm home," when he heard more than one voice coming from the living room. His mum hadn't had visitors in years. Skidding down the hallway and almost falling against the smooth wooden floorboards in his slippers, he grabbed the doorframe to the lounge to slow his momentum and pushed into the room, breathing slightly. "Oh, hello Izuku dear." His mum turned at the sound of his rather over-the-top entrance, smiling up at him from her position on their sofa, a cup of tea in hand. "Did you have fun with your classmates? How was Todoroki?" "Hello, Midoriya boy." Izuku felt like he was having a heart attack. Sitting on his mother's other side, in all his hero glory, was his mentor and teacher, a tiny china teacup in his massive hands and an enormous smile on his face as he grinned at Izuku. All Might. Notes. Here it is. Inko releases her wrath and I enjoyed writing it. I'd always kinda intended to write it this way, i.e. with some emotional heart-to-heart bits alongside her fierce motherly anger, As Inko isn't one to stay angry for long and I gotta set up for that lovely Toshinko later, happy face. This update is actually early as I'm sightseeing at Pompeii and MT Vesuvius all day tomorrow. My inner nerd is freaking out, y'all. So if there are any errors or annoying bits, do tell me, as I haven't had as much time as usual to edit this chapter. As always, thank you so much for reading. Drop a kudos if you'd like, and come shout at me on the hell site. Chapter 10. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. When flip phone storage cubbies magically appeared in every single one of the U.A changing rooms over the weekend, Izuku found himself among the select few people not surprised by the spontaneous alterations made to the campus. The storage units consisted of small, sealable compartments inside each student's pre-existing shoe locker, every pupil being assigned a unique key code to keep their future diary safe. Using them during the day was still optional, though heavily advised against. But before doing practical training exercises, all of the members in each class had to safely stow them away. The teachers were to ensure every student followed the rules by the book. No doubt this has something to do with what you were telling me about your mother? Hearing the familiar voice of Todoroki Shoto, Izuku looked up from where he'd been depositing his cell in his locker, seeing the boy just opening his own, and he gave him an exasperated smile. Shutting the door to his cubby, Izuku heard the small click of it sealing shut. Yeah, it was. All Might came over while we were all out the day before last. Oh dash, Todoroki breathed, checking his future diary one last time before locking it safely away and joining Izuku on the walk to the battlegrounds with the rest of their class. I hope it wasn't too embarrassing. They were sharing tea when I walked in. He lamented. And eating my taiyaki. The rest of the walk, Izuku told Todoroki all about what his mother had said about the meeting, receiving apologetic nods and the occasional quiet chuckle at a funny anecdote. What's this about your mum and All Might, Deku? Uraraka fell into step beside the two of them with a smile on her face, hands clasped together behind her back. She'd recently taken to tying her hair back for practical hero course classes, and her brown hair was securely tied in a bun, the longer strands left out at the front framing her face. It was nothing. He stammered, disliking the malicious glint in her large, oh-so-innocent eyes. Nothing saucy, I hope? She teased, grinning from ear to ear, wiggling her eyebrows absurdly and staring him straight in the face. My, that would be ironic. Uraraka? He squeaked, his face turning cherry red in a matter of nanoseconds and his hands gesticulating wildly in his embarrassment. Hey, don't even joke about that. From somewhere beside him, Izuku heard what sounded like a badly suppressed breath of laughter, but when he looked over, he was met by a perfectly emotionless Todoroki, staring straight ahead at nothing. "'Cause you know Uraraka continued from beside him, egged on by the other boy's chuckle and now trying to dance out of reach of Izuku's flailing arms. He obviously has his favorites and he dotes on you constantly. You're basically his son already. Uraraka, please. Sorry, You know it's true. It isn't. It is. Todoroki? Sorry, Midoriya. Since the identity of his soulmate had been made known to him, Shoto had noticed two things. Firstly, he'd begun viewing Midoriya in a new light. The boy was no longer a plain face in a crowd, and secondly, his cell also seemed to view Midoriya in a new light too. It seemed to have sparked a change in his flip phone, one that had puzzled him at first but that he was now growing accustomed to. His future diary had started naming specifics about the world surrounding Izuku. Vague placeholder titles like Mother and Friend became the names Izuku most often used for the people. Mum, Todoroki, and All Mights were now almost daily presences on the hourly updates. Predictions like 8:04 a.m. make a call had become more akin to call Ida for help on an English essay, and 1:08 a.m. use the internet turned into browse hero forum for the latest villain theories. Initially, Shoto thought the update to be creepy, an invasion of Midoriya's privacy even, and so for a while after the change he was hesitant to use his cell at all, merely leaving it in his cupboard when he wasn't at school. As some time passed, however, he found it bothered him less, and he eventually got used to it. When his flip phone showed him the words, 7:52 a.m., forget to make a lunch for the art field trip, Shoto accidentally made more katsudon than he needed, offering the extra helpings to Midoriya with a nod of the head and an "I really don't mind. I brought more than necessary, anyway. Thank you so much, Todoroki. Wow, this looks amazing," Midoriya said, his eyes glittering as Shoto pulled off the lid of his lunch. "Ah, I'm so lucky, you even cooked my favorite meal." "That's fortunate," he mumbled, trying to repress a knowing smile. He coughed to cover it up and handed Midoriya a pair of disposable chopsticks. "Here, I always carry spares." "That is indeed very responsible of you, Todoroki," Ida said from beside him, and somewhere across the other end of the modern contemporary art hall they sat in, Midnight rolled her eyes at the enthusiasm of all the students. Ida was making more wild, elaborate gestures as he spoke. "I should demonstrate the same level of preparation. I too will bring spares from now on." "Wow, Deku, I'm so jealous." Uraraka cooed, fawning over the lunch clutched in Shoto's palm. Todoroki's cooking looks to die for. Eventually, everyone began tucking into their own meals. Midoriya broke open the disposable chopsticks, and Shoto tried very hard not to think of their close proximity, the container propped on his knee for them both to eat from and Midoriya's shoulder touching his own. Izuku was fiddling with his utility belt, checking and double-checking its contents out of nervous trepidation. From somewhere up at the front of the class, Aizawa was running the class through the rules of a training exercise they'd all done many times before and no one was really listening, but Izuku was distracted for a totally different reason. The daily sparring partners for Class 1A were on a rotation system, and so far the only people he hadn't been pitted against were some of the most skilled, Tokoyami, Todoroki, and Bakugo. He was not looking forward to having to go up against any of them, breaking his bones in the process, if he may not even emerge victorious at the end of it. They were all so strong. A small tap on his shoulder made him jump, snapping him out of his reverie, and he threw a glance over his shoulder at the source of the contact. He was met by the calm, collected persona of Todoroki, staring not at him but at Aizawa, possibly to appear as though he was paying attention to the explanation, and the boy spoke out of the corner of his mouth. "Don't worry. I know you'll be fine. Just be careful." Izuku felt himself soften at his classmate's kind words and his shoulders loosened slightly as he smiled, looking back at Todoroki. "Thank you, I really appreciate it." Their eyes met for the briefest of seconds when the boy's gaze flicked his way, but then it was over, and Todoroki was looking back at Aizawa. He gave a small nod, however, and Izuku knew it had been his way of showing that he'd heard him. "You too," he hurried to supply. "You'll be amazing, you're always dash." "Midoriya, is there something you want to share with the class?" Izuku leapt about a foot off the ground, stammering out an apology to Aizawa as a few members of Class 1A laughed good-naturedly. After the talk, all of the students paired off to train and the session began. Needless to say, Todoroki had been right, and that afternoon Izuku won his match against Tokoyami. The rest of that day, however, Izuku felt fiery holes being drilled into the back of his skull, his hair standing on end, and he was too on edge to try and see who it may have been. Growing tired and skittish as a result, he packed up faster than lightning after their final lesson of the day and bolted for the door, hurrying down the main staircase in an attempt to reach the shoe lockers before anyone else did. Skidding to a halt by his cubby, he punched in the key code for his flip phone safe and extracted it before swapping out his indoor shoes for his red ones. Sitting gingerly on the edge of the wooden platform by his feet, he did up the laces on the sneakers and hauled his bag onto one shoulder, making for the exit as fast as humanly possible. Once outside, he felt the tension leave his body, his shoulders slackening as he relaxed. He was pretty sure he'd escaped their gaze, whoever they were, and he slowed to a trot, pulling out his future diary for something to do. The hourly update would refresh in a few minutes, and the last words from the current hour stared up at him from the screen. 3:34 p.m. Check future diary. 3:34 p.m. Worry about a friend. 3:35 p.m. Trip up the stairs. 3:36 p.m. Locate an acquaintance. His soulmate would be an awful mess within the next few minutes, it seemed, and he silently wished in his head that they would be more mindful when rushing about. Tripping on the stairs could be very dangerous sometimes. "Oi!" Izuku felt the very bottom of his stomach fall away at the sound of his cursed nickname being yelled at him from across the Uda courtyard, and he froze on the spot, unable to move. He was pretty sure he knew who had been glaring at him all day now. "Oi, you piece of shit!" He heard Bakugo snarl, accompanied by stomping footsteps that drew closer and closer to his spot by the school gate. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Still glued to the spot, partly out of fear and partially because he felt that anything he'd do would merely serve to further piss his classmate off, Izuku could do no more than watch on helplessly as Bakugo stormed into his field of view, hands in pockets and a face of thunder. "Look at me!" he raged, and Izuku's vision snapped up from his cell to meet Bakugo's eyes immediately. The boy scoffed, no doubt at the fear evident in Izuku's gaze, and withdrew a hand from his trouser pocket. Small, mini explosions, they were tiny compared to the ones unleashed upon him in the heroes versus villains battle, crackled and sparked across his palm, and in spite of himself, Izuku flinched away from them. He'd come so far since Katsuki's middle school reign of terror, yet when his mind surged back to that afternoon almost a year ago where he'd been told to jump from the school roof, he suddenly felt very sick. The noise of the explosions died down, and Bakugo's voice, equally as jarring and deafening, filled the silence of the grounds. Deku-dash, the boy's upper lip curled as though he were looking upon something foul on the sole of his shoe. "You may have slipped past Featherface today, but it doesn't mean sheet, you hear me? I'm still 10 times stronger already than both of you punk-butt losers will ever be." Kakinwa-dash. A quiet static, though loud enough to have been heard by both of them, sounded from the little speaker on the back of Izuku's future diary, tinny and brash, innocently signaling a new update for the hour. Instinctively, his eyes sought out the screen of his cell, intending to read the new information, when a strong, agile hand snared his wrist and yanked it up to eye level. Wincing, Izuku looked past the flip phone at Bakugo and felt anxiety blossom in his cysti. The boy's eyes were ablaze with newfound fury. "Are you even effing listening to me, you useless piece of shit? Maybe this'll make you pay attention." And then he yanked Izuku's cell from his hand. For a good few seconds, Izuku couldn't breathe. Panic, like he'd never felt it before, seemed to consume him whole as he watched his entire life being clutched in the hands of the boy who had literally threatened to kill him. Whoa Bakugo, dude, chill. Running footsteps could be heard from somewhere near the school entrance. To Izuku, the noise sounded like it was being played to him with his head underwater, and the voice of Kirishima Aijuru pierced the air. There was more than one set of footsteps, however, and surely enough Kirishima came into view, closely followed by Todoroki Shoto. "Dude," the redhead breathed, sweat beading on his forehead as he placed his hands on his knees to catch his breath. "That's not cool, come on. Give him the future diary back, man." And then, when he received no obvious response from the hothead, "Seriously, dude?" For a painful, agonizing second of anticipation, the air seemed to vibrate with tension. Then, as though merely handing back a toy to a sulking child, Bakugo roughly shoved the teal flip phone back into Izuku's palms. "Whatever," he grunted, kicking the ground as he turned his back on them all. "Just don't forget it, Deku." And with that he stormed off, shoulders hunched. "God." Kirishima breathed, his brow furrowed. "Hey, Midoriya, sorry about him, man." He looked off in the direction Bakugo had left. He'd been said since Ida beat him in training today, but wow, that was so unmanly. Izuku nodded slowly, suddenly becoming aware of just how quickly he was breathing. "Midoriya," Todoroki began, and though he was usually so placid and reticent, he sounded strangely vulnerable in that moment. Worry very obviously laced throughout his tone. "Are you okay?" "I'm Dash," Izuku mumbled, glancing around skittishly and clutching the teal-colored cell to his knee like a lifeline. "I'm fine, yes, it's Dash." "It's all right." His eyes found the ones belonging to Kirishima first, then sweeping up to Todoroki's mismatched ones after. "Thank you both, I just Dash." He glanced past their shoulders and to the street just beyond the school gates, where Bakugo's figure had long since rounded the corner and disappeared from sight. All the same, the image of his future diary being in the boy's clutches was burned onto his retina, white-hot and painful. "I've got to go." And hoisting his bag into a more comfortable position on his back, he took off at a run, the sound of his red shoes hitting the pavement strangely loud in his ears and his hands still shaking where they held the straps of his large, yellow rucksack. Notes. Finally back home and uploaded before midnight. Achievement unlocked. I really enjoyed writing this chapter while away. Maybe it was the happy vibes that made parts of this so fluffy? Happy face. I am also very aware though that this chapter was a bit of an emotional roller coaster. I have no regrets. My schedule is back to normal now, so there should be a lot more time for me to write, thank goodness. As per usual, let me know if there are any glaring problems, and if you want, come yell at me on the Hell site. Have a good week guys, and feel free to chat to me in the comments. Chapter 11. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. The day had been just like any other to Shoto. The class had broken up like usual at the end of the day with people rushing off to escape the school grounds, and so Midoriya's abrupt exit went almost entirely unnoticed. Shoto only happened to notice it because he had been intending to talk to the boy about the project they were to work on together over the next few weeks, but when he saw the mop of curly green hair dart out of the classroom door without warning, his brow furrowed in confusion. Had he not asked Midoriya to wait for him before the class had begun? Concern had begun to bubble at the pit of his stomach before he brushed it off. Midoriya wasn't incompetent and could certainly fend for himself. He probably needed the toilet and thus had to rush off. He decided to make his way down the main staircase along with the rest of the school, allowing himself to be carried by the ebb and flow of happily chatting students, and when he reached his locker, he changed his indoor shoes for his own sneaker and withdrew his cell from its locker. The concern he had tried to brush off was still gnawing at him, however small and unnoticeable it may have been, and so on a whim he flipped open his future diary and peered at Midoriya's hourly log. He bristled slightly upon beginning to read, but when his gaze trailed down to the end of the block of text, his stomach dissolved at the very last line of the prediction. 3:35 p.m. aggressively taunted by Kaken in front of the U.A gates. 3:38 p.m. future diary is badly cracked by Kaken. His eyes seemed were glued to the only word on the update that mattered. Cracked. He was unsure what the repercussions of having one's soul cracked were, but he wasn't about to sit around and wait to find out. And via his own soulmate no less. Mind racing and future diary still in hand, he slammed the door to his locker shut and launched himself back towards the main staircase. There was no way on earth he'd be able to subdue Bakugo alone. The boy hated him almost as much as he seemed to despise Midoriya himself, and his appearance would no doubt only prove to further aggravate him. No. His best chance lay with convincing someone who could calm his explosive classmate down to accompany him to the scene. And there was only one person he knew of that could do that. The throng of students surging down the stairs was making it unbelievably difficult to head up them, and he felt frustration writhe in his psyche. Ramming through the multitude of people with his shoulder, he burst out of the rear end of the crowd and went toppling over with the momentum of his push, tumbling forward. His knee smashed into the step below him as he fell and he jarred his wrist painfully on the sharp corner of another. Swearing none too subtly and ignoring the throbbing in both his limbs, he powered on until he reached the 1A homeroom, arriving in under a minute and slamming the door open with more force than was perhaps necessary. The occupants of the room, Kirishima and Yaoyorozu, who he had remembered were on cleanup duty that evening, stood stock still, both staring at him and apparently glued to the spot with shock. Kirishima dashed, he rasped out, gasping for air and clutching his wrist in his uninjured hand. Bakugo, he's dashed, he cast around wildly for something to say that would possibly convey the urgency of the situation in the little time they had. Bakugo's taken Midoriya's cell, he's threatening him dash. Shoto didn't think he'd ever seen anyone's eyes widen faster than Kirishima's did in that moment. The boy's stance became rigid, the cleaning rag in his hand suddenly forgotten on the floor, and from beside him Yaoyorozu paled, a hand going over her mouth. What? Kirishima breathed. Why have to come now? Shoto all but shouted. Please. The gears started turning and his classmate seemed to grind into motion, shouting a brief apology to Yaoyorozu before abandoning his cleaning post in the classroom and racing off down the corridor towards the staircase, Shoto hot on his heels. He only hoped they could make it in time. If the tinny, barely audible static emitting from his red and white patterned cell was anything to go by as they both stood alone by the gates, the sound of his soulmate's prediction log being rewritten. They had. Midoriya was incredibly jumpy the morning after the incident, which, thank God, somehow hadn't been spread around too far from the people directly affected, and Uraraka and Ida had certainly noticed. The homeroom was as noisy as ever, and the boy sat at his chair, a little more hunched over than usual, shoulders arched higher than normal, and knuckles whiter than ever before as he clenched his pencil with a vice-like grip. "Come on, Degdash," Uraraka said, making him leap a little off his chair as she perched on the edge of his desk. Ida bristled indignantly from behind her. "What's up? You look like you've seen a ghost?" "I'm okay," he started, settling down slightly and glancing rather obviously in Bakugo's direction. "I'm just tired," he finished lamely, his face reddening at the terrible lie. "Well, you look pretty down in the dumps to me, and I don't know whether it's just because it's raining outside or because of something else, but I'm gonna cheer you up," she said, grinning happily and flashing a thumbs up. She then hopped off his table and slung an arm around Ida's neck, pulling him down to her level in a headlock and scruffing up his hair. "Tell you what, Deku, we'll go out after school. You, me and Ida downtown. How about it? Hey, we can even get you ice cream." Midoriya then looked up slowly, and maybe it was the prospect of spending time with his friends, perhaps it was the amusingly distressed look Ida had in place as he tried to fix his hair, or even the offer of ice cream, but the corners of his mouth began to twitch upwards, tentative at first though growing by the second until it became one of his trademark, sun-omitting smiles. Shoto felt an arrow go through his heart at the sight of it. "Okay," Midoriya said quietly, nodding his head, his green curls bouncing around. "Thanks, guys." "No problem," Uraraka returned, punching the air in victory and dragging the unamused class president back to their seats near Azui, who leaned in to chat the moment they got back. From across the classroom, Shoto couldn't hear what they were saying, but it was apparent that the two girls got on very well. Ochako was talking animatedly, her rosy cheeks blazing, and Tsuyu had a kind, relaxed smile in place as she watched the girl talk. It was in those rare moments alone, watching other people interact from afar, that Shoto often found himself wishing he could converse with his friends in that manner. He felt as though he were watching them from behind glass, through a window, and that they were untouchable. That their level of companionship was unattainable. And then Midoriya spoke to him, and the glass shattered, the shards falling to the ground. "Hey Todoroki, I'm sorry about yesterday. I didn't mean to run off like that. I really do appreciate what you did for me." Turning to his friend, Shoto saw the boy smiling at him. That smile was for him. How was that smile for him? And he swiveled in his chair to better face his classmate. "There's no need to apologize." And he paused, carefully considering his next words, unsure of what to say. If you wanted to know, I wasn't offended in the slightest." "Really?" Midoriya said, looking doubtful. "I didn't even thank you for trying to help. It was the least I could do." Shoto replied honestly. "Anyone would have, I think." Midoriya smiled again, small and hesitant but definitely a smile, before nodding and continuing. "But still, thank you, Todoroki. I'm only sorry you and Kirishima got caught in that. Kaken would have let up eventually, and he probably wouldn't have actually done anything, but, oh my god, is your wrist okay?" Shoto was taken aback by his sudden outcry and he glanced down at his own wrist in confusion. He had his mechanical pencil clutched in his right hand from where he had been writing the day's subjects into his school planner moments before, but hidden just below the cuff of his gray blazer, a purple bruise was very obviously poking out from under the material. His handwriting was also noticeably messier than its usual pristine format. Shoto shifted his legs uncomfortably underneath his desk, glad that the deep graze on his left knee was fully hidden by his trouser leg. "Oh, it's nothing. Don't worry." Midoriya deadpanned him. "It isn't nothing, it looks painful," he said, his face reverting to one of concern. "How did you end up with that?" "I tripped yesterday afternoon. It's nothing, honestly," Shoto mumbled. He nervously tugged his sleeve back over the bruise and glanced back at his friend. He almost did a double take. Midoriya's eyes were blown wide, his expression clearly betraying the fact that his mind was racing a mile a minute. "You tripped?" he whispered, so quietly that Shoto almost didn't catch it. "Yesterday? After school?" Midoriya he said, fear suddenly bubbling up in his stomach. He couldn't tell what the boy was thinking and he needed to change the subject. If you're that concerned, I'll go to recovery, girl. There was a pause where his classmate with curly green hair and an abundance of freckles simply stared at him, searching his face for something. Shoto didn't know what. And then the moment passed, and Midoriya shook himself slightly, nodding and smiling at him. Yeah? You should do that before classes start. You won't be able to write otherwise. Shoto sighed, nodding and stood up. Would you mind informing Aizawa-sensei when he arrives that I am at the infirmary? I could take you? Midoriya offered kindly, making to stand up, but Shoto shook his head firmly. I appreciated the offer, really, he said apologetically. But it wouldn't do for two people to miss the homeroom session. Midoriya agreed at that, seating himself once more and fidgeting with his hands slightly before wishing Todoroki well as he turned to leave. Shoto quickly offered him a small smile in reply and turned on his heel, hastily making his way out of the classroom and to the infirmary. Shoto hadn't seen, however, the way Midoriya's hand had twitched towards his pocket, itching to grab a future diary that wasn't there, instead locked safely away at home after the previous day's incident. He hadn't heard the way the cogs had begun whirring in Midoriya's brain, trying desperately to connect the dots in an array of disjointed, meager memories, and he hadn't felt the green eyes that followed him out of the room, right up until the second he'd disappeared around the doorframe, continuing to stare at that spot long after he'd vanished from view. Notes. I almost missed my update deadline. Oops. Thanks for your patience. I hit a bit of a block trying to figure out how to advance the plot forward, so this chapter is basically the result of the copious requests I saw to see the scene from show's POV too, or to at least see what his cell said. The next chapter will have more going on for sure, so hold on for that. As usual, thank you for reading, drop a comment if there are any issues, and come screech at me on the Hell site if you feel so inclined. Chapter 12. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. The Mizutafu downtown shopping district was known for being large, loud, and absolutely packed 24/7, so Izuku wasn't at all surprised to find himself wedged between his two friends in line for ice creams, craning his neck over the sea of heads to see the flavors and prices as he stood on his tiptoes. Do you know what you're getting, Deku? Uraraka quizzed, grinning at him across her shoulders. We're almost at the front. Why yeah, I think, he said, eyeing the plethora of options laid out before him, narrowing it down to 3 before finally making his decision. 1 strawberry for me please, chirped Uraraka from right in front of him, and he jumped slightly when the man behind the counter prompted him for his choice with a kind, "And for you, sir?" He stammered out his order and handed over some coins before stepping to one side to stay out of harm's way, and after Ida purchased his choice of a pistachio-flavored ice cream, they all received their food. Scuttling away as fast as possible, the 3 of them headed for the food court and silently prayed they could snatch an empty table. Miraculously finding one, they slid into the booth, Uraraka going first and Izuku sitting beside her across from Ida, the table between them and the bustling shopping center laid out before them in full view. So Uraraka began after some jovial small talk, biting into her waffle cone with a satisfying crunch and turning his way. What had you so down in the dumps today, huh? Ow. Izuku began cautiously, taking a bite of his own cone to give him time to contemplate how he'd respond. I've just been quite stressed recently, and it wasn't anything big really. I love being at you, even if it was quite a big jump at first, but the schoolwork and my mother and all might and dash. Whoa Deku, slow down. Uraraka cut across, her eyebrows having disappeared up behind her bangs. Just take a sec and cut to the chase. He breathed a sigh, huffing out slightly and knitting his brows together as he stared down at the rest of his ice cream which was beginning to melt, pooling at the bottom of his edible waffle cone. The noise of the bustling shoppers walking past seemed to wash right over him, his head filling instead with thoughts of future diaries, lifelong bullies, dual-colored hair and piercing heterochromatic eyes. He then looked up from his dessert and to the 2 people sat opposite him, watching him intently and concern woven into their gazes. Then he knew in that moment that if there were any 2 people he would instill his trust in, it'd be them. He tried, his voice catching in his throat and forcing him to gulp before speaking again. It's multiple things really. I mean, Kaken, He felt moisture well up in his eyes at the memory and he angrily willed them away, shaking his head a fraction to ground himself. I just thought I'd grown accustomed to how he acts around me, and I never thought he'd actually take my cell after refusing to when we were little, so I guess I was just a little shaken, but perhaps he was having a bad day like Kirishima had said? And I've also been feeling so disoriented and self-conscious recently, I've never dash. Hold up, we can come back to that dash, Uraraka interrupted, eyeing him with what Izuku thought was an intense mixture of worry and incredulity. But sorry if I misheard that, Bakugo took your cell? He grabbed it from you? Izuku nodded, looking first at the horror on her face and then at the shock painted onto Ida's features. Oh, I am going to skin him alive, the girl snarled, a rage unlike any other Izuku had felt emanating from her as she slammed two hands down on the tabletop and rose menacingly to her feet. Just you wait, dash. Uraraka. Ida's reproachful gaze stopped her in her tracks, and with an angry pout in place she slowly sank back into her seat, brooding. Forgive me, Midoriya, Ida started very slowly, fixing his glasses as he spoke, his tone full of caution. But why did you neglect to tell us this? I just dash, Izuku attempted, hanging his head in anguish, unable to meet either of their eyes. I just dash. Didn't want to worry us, came two voices at once. Izuku slowly raised his head at his friend's sudden interjections and found the pair of them smiling at him, albeit with sadness and concern very prevalent on both faces, but smiling at him nonetheless. Somewhat confused, he pet his head to one side and shot them a questioning look, and Uraraka let out a snort of amusement through her nose. Deku, she began, sending an exasperated look his way. You're the most selfless person I think I've ever met. Only you could be threatened with your life and then hide it because you thought people would worry about you. Yeah, he muttered sheepishly, scratching the side of his cheek in embarrassment. But I promise you it wasn't that bad. Kaken knows that hurting me would have permanently damaged his chances of becoming a hero. He wouldn't have done anything. But this isn't about him, Deku. I don't care about his hero career right now, Uraraka said, bristling. This about that fact that your life was in his hands. Izuku remained silent after that. He had no doubt in his mind that Kaken would have returned his cell to him unharmed, but he couldn't help the jolt of fear that shot through him at her words. Her words, which went hand in hand with a nasty reminder of the feeling of panic that had coursed through him 24 hours ago, were ultimately true once he had properly thought it through. It was never going to be about what didn't happen, but about what did. I'm sorry, but this cannot go unreported, Midoriya. Izuku's head snapped up immediately. No, Ida please, you don't understand dash. But he stopped at the hand that his friend raised to silence him and the look of determination on the class representative's face. Forget the school policies, what Bakugo did yesterday is against the human rights laws, it was illegal, and if you wish for the incident to be kept as quiet as possible, then going to a teacher at the very least is something I would highly recommend. He frowned then, looking at Izuku very sadly. I can understand wanting to avoid taking to higher authorities, but I will not allow it to remain among unqualified teenagers like ourselves. Uraraka nodded in agreement at that, and Izuku knew he would get no further. We're here for you, Deku, she said, smiling at him encouragingly. All of our friends are. Yamamo, through Todoroki, you just have to tell us when you need us, 'cause sometimes your smile can be very convincing. Ida nodded, a somewhat relaxed expression finally fixed in place and his ice cream also finished. Speaking of that smile dash, Uraraka began with a grin. Where is it today? Come here. And with that, she engulfed him in a strong bear hug. Caught off guard at first as he was not used to being hugged at all, Izuku cautiously wound his arms around her shoulders, eventually sinking into the hold she had on him and reveling in the warmth and care of her aura. They broke apart and Izuku found himself cracking a small grin, causing the other occupants of their booth to smile back at him. Now dashed, his friend said, grasping his shoulders in both of her hands, being careful not to touch him with all 5 fingers. Wasn't there something else? Oh, yeah, he said, remembering where his train of thought had been heading earlier on and immediately blushing. He scratched the back of his head nervously. Old habits die hard. Why, there was. The two people opposite waited patiently with smiles on their faces as he gathered his wits, trying to form a coherent explanation for his predicament, and he found himself overcome with emotion. Not for the first time that afternoon, his eyes grew damp as tears collected along his lash line, and as he looked right back at his friends, who had both quickly paled at his sudden emotional deterioration, his face scrunched up tight. Sniffling, he tried to explain himself. "Sorry, he gasped, and as the tears spilt over onto his cheeks and landed on the fabric of his gray uniform trousers, he raised an arm to force them away and steadied his breathing before continuing. "Sorry, I'm just so happy to have you guys around." Unsurprisingly, his classmates seemed to deflate in their chairs as their anxiety and concern drained away. Affection seeped into their expressions, fondness taking over. Izuku went on, now hiccuping slightly. "I don't know if either of you knew this, he said, unable to quite face them and so directing his gaze downwards instead. "But I didn't have any friends before you." "None," Uraraka whispered, and although he couldn't see her countenance at all, he could hear the slight wilt in her tone. He shook his head, green curls bouncing around. "But ever since coming here and meeting everyone besides Kaken, I've been so out of it. You guys, you're so nice. Everyone's so friendly, and Todoroki has been so kind to me. I wish I knew how to talk to him without just rambling." Had he have been looking up and not at his knees, he may have seen the knowing glances and exasperated amusement Ida and Uraraka exchanged between them. "Even the teachers don't mind me, and I'm really not used to it," Izuku said through a half-chuckle as he sat up, throwing his head back and resting it against the cushioned backrest of their booth. He could see their faces then, and they were both smiling, Uraraka's brown eyes even welling up with happy emotion. "I guess I'm overwhelmed." "Oh, Deku!" she exclaimed, practically leaping at him and wrapping her arms around his neck, eyes streaming and dampening his uniform. "We're so glad to have you here too, and don't you ever forget it." They were both a blubbering mess by that point, unmindful of nosy passers-by and curious stares from neighboring booths. Ida too looked very moved by Izuku's confession, and patiently waited for the two to break apart. After some time, during which tissues were dispensed and eyes were dried, Uraraka was calm enough to form a coherent sentence, and she seemed to light up brighter than the sun in less than a nanosecond as an idea struck her. "Let's go shopping. Come on, Deku." And in an instant, she had a strong grip around both of their wrists and began dragging them in the direction of the nearest store visible to them. "Hey, you two, look at these, they're amazing, oh, and cheap." Izuku glanced up from where he'd been unashamedly observing a rack of All Might merchandise. Would it be weird to buy more now that he was literally the pro-hero's successor? And found his two friends having a silent showdown, refusing to break eye contact. Uraraka had 4 shirts clutched in her hands, all on hangers, and although he couldn't quite make out their designs, he had a vague feeling from the identical patterns why she had picked them up. She had been ruthlessly digging through rack after rack of clothing over the last hour for matching garments that they could wear. Ida, who had policed the hunt much to his exasperation so far, had been made to rate each item on a scale of 1 to 10, with how often he thought he'd wear it if purchased, and it seemed he was almost at the end of his tether. However, when the girl's face melted to one of a pleading pout, he visibly crumbled, unable to remain frustrated for long. "Go on." Delighted, she held the shirts up for them to see. The garments were, in fact, of All Might's brand, and by that factor alone Izuku was already sold. They seemed to be subtler in style, however. The shirts themselves were button-ups and collared, and had a thin grid-like pattern on them. On the BRST pocket, the No. 1 Pro Hero's logo was embroidered to look like his trademark hairstyle, and to top it all off Uraraka had picked out 4 distinct colors from the rack. Green, blue, pink, and red. "They look really good," Izuku said, grinning at her and taking one of them from her hands. He ran a thumb over the stitched embroidery, smiling. "I don't have this one yet either." "Whose is the red one?" came Ida's voice, curious. "Todoroki's, of course." Izuku looked up at her quickly, expression starting at confused and then gradually morphing into a beam. "That's a great idea." Uraraka nodded enthusiastically, her hair fluttering about wildly, and as he handed her back the shirt he had taken, they heard Ida sigh. "Okay, hand them to me then, Uraraka. I'll go and pay for them." The girl said, immediately tensing up, her forehead creasing as her brows furrowed. "That's not Dash," I said. Ida only smiled, carefully taking the bundle of apparel from her arms and turning away. "Please, don't worry about it, it is my pleasure." She frowned at the shape of his retreating back and looked at Izuku helplessly before trailing after him, making towards the checkout line. She perked up, however, when in the queue they passed a display of small phone charms, all hanging from little hooks with the label of all items 60 yen, 2 for 100 yen, tacked onto the stand. "Look, Deku, oh, aren't these cute?" Izuku turned, tearing his eyes away from his phone to look at the setup. Row upon row of little charms met his gaze, and a memory seemed to flash through his mind. He had been anticipating the start of the UA entrance exam, had seen Uraraka's future diary as he waited, and had made a note to buy one too. Well, now was the perfect time, was it not? As Uraraka pored over them beside him, his eyes raked over every design, style and color available, glancing back and forth and double-checking they weren't holding up the line they were waiting in by mistake. Quickly coming to a final decision, he snatched up 2 of the little accessories from the display to make the most of the available offer and fumbled for his money, handing over 100 yen at the checkout and thanking the cashier when she handed him the 2 charms, neatly packaged and wrapped in a paper sleeve together. Notes. Another chapter, my guys, gals and NB pals. Quickly gonna say sorry if this update has any errors in it. I've busted up my fingers recently and had to use speech recognition software to write 90% of this chapter, oops. I said to a few of you that this chapter would be fun. Well, it was also hella angsty. Sorry for forgetting to mention that, LMAO. As usual, thank you for reading. Please drop a comment if you see any issues, and come screech at me on the hell site if you feel so inclined. Chapter 13. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. The next morning at school, Aizawa gave an unexpected announcement to the class. His usual bored expression turned dark and jaded. "In case some of you haven't already noticed, Bakugo isn't here," he said, scanning the class full of cautiously alert students. Izuku raised his head from his planner where he had been absent-mindedly doodling in the corner of his notebook and quickly sought out his teacher, his entire attention now fixed on him. "He's been internally excluded for 3 days. An outbreak of whispers rippled throughout the class at his words, confusion evident in their voices and everyone's curiosity suddenly sky-high. With a single passive gesture of the hand, however, silence fell over them like a blanket and the tension in the air grew thicker and heavier. "I'd hoped I wouldn't have to do this considering the extra safety measures implemented not long ago, but it seems some of us cannot behave properly despite all of you being well on your way to becoming certified heroes. You have a class trip coming up very soon, and if you wish to attend you had all better start acting your ages." The pro-hero's eyes narrowed as he scanned the classroom, displeasure evident in his voice. "I will only say it once, so listen up. You do not touch someone else's future diary without their expressed permission, not even for a second." The room was deathly silent then, shocked expressions and looks of concern on every face. And at the very back of the classroom, Izuku Midoriya sank lower and lower into his chair in an attempt to disappear completely. "I hope I've made myself perfectly clear." With that, it was like someone had flicked a SW's on their teacher. Aizawa's harried, tired front was back in place and he leant against the teacher's podium, almost as though he were bored. Class dismissed. The room erupted into motion, people hurrying to pack up and escape the swelling, suffocating tension hovering over them, and Izuku's classmates all made mad dashes for the door. Just as he managed to cram his pencil case into his backpack, however, a voice sounded from the front of the room that sent him to a grinding halt. "Not you, Midoriya. A word, please." Grimacing as he felt his heart sink in his he glanced over at the door to where his friends had all been waiting for him, Uraraka looking back in confusion and Todoroki holding the door open for him expectantly. "Sorry guys," he started, forcing a small smile onto his face in the hopes that it would dissipate some of their obvious growing concern. "I'll catch you all up, go on ahead." After a few nods and some "see you later"s from his friends, the door slid shut with a thunk, and he was left alone in the classroom with his teacher. Steeling himself with a deep breath, Izuku turned on the spot and at long last, locked his eyes onto the man who had called him back. His worry faded, though, at the sight of the pro-hero perched on top of a table on the front row, slouching slightly with one foot propped up on the desk's chair. Aizawa's relaxed posture somehow lessened Izuku's nerves, as it was evident that he wasn't about to reprimand him. Shuffling toward the teacher, Izuku kept both of his hands clasped firmly on the yellow straps of his bag, perhaps for something to cling to for comfort, and hesitantly waited for the man to explain why he'd held him back. When at last he spoke, though, it wasn't at all what Izuku had been expecting. "Ida informed me of what happened, as you know already, but I thought I'd make sure you were okay." Thoroughly taken aback by the uncharacteristic words Aizawa spoke, Izuku tripped over his own words in his haste to answer. "Oh, why yes, I think so, sir." It seemed for the briefest of seconds that his teacher was analyzing him, searching his face for anything that may reveal his answer as a lie, but then the moment passed and Aizawa huffed a slightly amused breath through his nose. "Okay then, kid." Getting to his feet, the teacher stretched like a cat would after a long nap, and Izuku took a step back, waiting nervously for a dismissal and staring at his toes. "You know, came Aizawa's voice, and Izuku raised his head to meet his gaze. "You should stand up for yourself more. You're a smart kid." And at that the man placed a hand atop his head, patted twice and made for the door, snagging his mustard-yellow sleeping bag from the floor on his way out and not once looking back as he rounded the corner. Izuku stood frozen, glued to the spot by shock and conflicting emotions. He had been overly intimidated by Eraserhead the moment he'd set foot in the homeroom on their first day of school all those weeks ago, but just then, he raised two hands to the top of his head and pressed on the curls slightly, almost as though he were ghosting the touch from just a moment ago, and he felt relief suddenly swell in his threatening to spill over in the form of tears gathering in his eyes. Being encouraged by his teacher, being told he was smart by a genius pro-hero, meant the world and more to Izuku, and he grinned to himself happily in the quiet of the empty classroom. Lost in his thoughts for a moment, he jumped a foot into the air when he heard the bell sound in the corridor, signifying the start of the first lesson of the day, and he leapt into motion, hurrying out of the classroom and taking care to apologize to Cementos when he finally tumbled through the door to his modern literature class. Shoto stood in the aisle between dining tables later that day with a frown deeply etched into the lines of his face. He had been one of the last people out of the class after art, and now that he had finally gotten his lunch, tray clutched in his hands, he couldn't locate his friends. Their usual table was occupied seniors who the first years didn't dare ask to move, and so he was left looking for somewhere to sit. It was then that he spotted them. A group of people, namely Jairu and Kaminari's friendship group, had all risen to their feet not too far away, seemingly finished with their meals, and Shoto had a sudden idea. Jogging over to them, though taking care not to tip his lunch over, he managed to catch up to them before they left. Balancing his tray on one steady palm, he hesitated a second before reaching out with his other hand and gently tapped one of his classmates on the shoulder. Yaoyorozu turned curiously at the contact, her look of confusion quickly morphing into one of pleasant surprise upon meeting his gaze. "Ah, hello Todoroki. How can I help? Do you mind?" "Just talk," he said carefully, wincing at his own awkwardness. She seemed to study him for a moment before smiling again with a kind nod. "Of course." After standing patiently to one side as she said her goodbyes to the rest of her friends, Shoto then placed his meal down on the table they had just vacated and took a seat, Yaoyorozu placing herself down on the chair opposite him. "So what did you want to discuss? I presume it has something to do with Midoriya?" Shoto, who had just been about to eat a mouthful of stew when she had spoken, let his spoon fall back into his bowl, trying not to stare at her. She merely grinned back at him, all too knowingly. "Todoroki, it's very obvious you two are good friends. I can't think of who else it'd be about." Shoto breathed a massive, internal sigh of relief, and he was sure he visibly slumped over too. He had immediately jumped to the conclusion that she had somehow pieced together their connecting future diaries, but thankfully it appeared not. "Alright," he began, resigning himself to plow on through the conversation. At the end of the day it could only benefit him, after all. "I actually wanted your help with advice about social situations." At that she really did look a little confused, and she tilted her head to one side questioningly, a silent request for him to elaborate, it seemed. "I just feel he began, unsure how best to articulate himself. Damn it, that's exactly the reason I'm here in the first place. I feel like I can't properly communicate with him, and with everyone else for that matter, and you always seem to know what you're doing around Jairu and the others. He went on. I didn't have much social experience before starting you today, so you could say I'm rather behind in that respect. Understanding swept across her features at that, and she looked up thoughtfully. That makes sense. Do you want to just ask questions, or? Yes, please, he said, gratitude evident in every syllable he spoke. Okay, go ahead then. Where do you want to start? Gearing himself up to absorb as much information as was humanly possible in one short lunch break, Shoto sat up straight, took a deep breath and looked right at his soon-to-be social mentor. How would you make sure someone knew you enjoyed being with them? So what did Aizawa want earlier, Deku? The lunch hall was just as noisy as ever, and Izuku almost didn't catch Uraraka's question over the clattering of his chopsticks and the chatter coming from all directions. He had to speak up from a mumble to make himself heard at all, feeling shy and vaguely embarrassed. Just checking on me, nothing much. Speaking of that, I actually wanted to apologize, Midoriya. Izuku turned to see Ida looking directly at him, face set in determined resolve. Confused, he listened to his friend continue. It was very obvious to me this morning that you were uncomfortable with the situation surrounding Bakugo. Perhaps I could have dash. Not at all. Izuku stammered quickly, hurrying to put his chopsticks down so he could wave his hands in front of his face. Don't say sorry, you did the right thing. I really think so. There were a few seconds where a doubtful expression flitted across the class president's face, clearly unsure whether or not to believe him, but at Izuku's thoroughly sincere, honestly, Ida, I mean it. He nodded and smiled, resuming the consumption of his curry. What about this trip, huh? Uraraka said, excitement evident in both her voice and her eyes. What do you reckon it'll be? And with which teacher? Maybe endurance training? Izuku suggested on a whim, trying to throw in an idea. Ooh, I bet it'll be with All Might. His lessons are always really extravagant. Perhaps it will be another educational visit, not unlike the art gallery trip? Oh, going off campus sounds fun. Their voices seemed to meld together as conversation returned to normal, sinking into familiar territory, and Izuku found himself easing up once more. His contentment was shortly interrupted, however, by the sound of Uraraka saying words that jolted him right back down to earth. Hey, Todoroki. Looking around for the subject of her call, Izuku found the boy in question stood quietly off to the side of their table, his barely touched lunch in his hands and an abashed expression evident on his features. I know lunch is almost over, but he threw a hopeful look their way, gulping. Could I join you for lunch anyway? Of course, why would we ever say no? Uraraka replied, familial laughter bubbling up her throat and a welcoming smile on her face. She even budged over a chair at the table so he could sit opposite Izuku, and before they knew it, conversation had started up again, the altercation returning to the topic of the fabled class trip. Still, Izuku noticed a very clear shift in the weight of the discussion, and though he prided himself on his observational skills, it took him so long to put his finger on the difference that it seemed to hit him square in the face once he had come to realize the change. Todoroki was definitely playing a bigger role in the conversation than usual. It wasn't that he was being more active in putting forward suggestions and topic starters. He was being more open to questions, slightly more assured in his replies, and perhaps even more fluid with his words. None of it was for lack of trying, though. His face was working at a mile a minute, his mind clearly working through every possible response available to him, and it was very obvious to Izuku that this level of social participation was taking a lot of effort from him. He knew in that instance that the change in his friend wasn't because of some miracle confidence epiphany, but rather because, perhaps, Todoroki was trying his hardest to converse smoothly with his friends in order to prove something to himself. After all, if there was one expression that Izuku would be able to spot from a mile off until the day he died, it'd be determination. Notes. Trips in through the front door with this very late update. I'm still alive, I swear. I'm so sorry this was so heavily delayed. I was unbelievably distracted by my GCSE results coming through yesterday, but thankfully I did well, so my attention can now return here. Also, Thanks to @Winroll for the inspiration for Shoto's POV part of this chapter. Ilism, you're amazing. And as usual, drop a kudos or a comment if you enjoyed / if you see any issues, and if you want come yell at me on the hell site. Chapter 14. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. It had been a good day for Shoto. The weather was pleasant hot with it. Cool, light breeze. He flew through an English literature test set by Present Mike, and to top it all off, he had been gifted something from his closest friends that had probably made his whole year. He had been walking down the path that lead to the Uda gates after school, barely even an hour ago, when he had picked up on voices coming from somewhere distant behind him. Turning, he had spotted a small cluster of people running pell-mell across the courtyard, the nearest of the three shouting and waving her arms around wildly, an enormous grin plastered across her face. She seemed totally oblivious to the stares they were receiving from passing students thanks to the ruckus they were causing, and somehow he couldn't keep a small smile of his own from creeping onto his features. Coming to a halt on the spot in order to close the gap between them, Shoto had waited patiently for his three friends to finally reach him, and after the trio had finally regained their breath, Uraraka had spoken. "Oh, I'm glad we caught you before you left. We were going to do this earlier but Deku was in the infirmary." "Here dash," she said, still breathing slightly as she swung her bag off her shoulder and unzipped it. "We have something to give you." After a few more seconds of rustling, during which Midoriya had bounced on the ball of his feet in anticipation, was that nervousness or excitement? Uraraka extracted something soft and folded up from her rucksack before tucking it under her arm and doing up the zip on her bag again. Holding it out properly for him to see, she had then flashed him a grin that seemed to reach both her eyes and her ears, and loaded it eagerly into his arms. "The three of us went out shopping together recently and it was my idea, but Ida here paid for them and Midoriya approved with us that you'd like it, so even though I thought up the gift it's really a present from all of us." She had spoken incredibly quickly, rivaling the speed with which Midoriya often articulated whenever he muttered endearingly, and Shoto had glanced from her to the bundle of fabric in his grasp. Adjusting his hold on the item, he gingerly unfolded the cloth with hands that were ever so slightly trembling and lifted it up, the creases coming loose and the garment tumbling open. It was a shirt. Red in color and checkered in pattern, the piece of clothing somehow struck a chord in him, his heart skipping a few beats in his ear. Not because the type of pattern was one of his favorites, or because it was somehow the perfect size, or even because it was an All Might brand item, which, mind you, meant he was going to wear it around his father for as long as humanly possible, but it struck a chord in him because it was living proof that in a moment where he hadn't been present, they'd thought of him. They'd bought him something not out of obligation, but out of the goodwill of their own hearts, and if that didn't resonate with him, then he didn't think anything else ever would. He had then looked up at the trio, his gaze first landing on Ida who stood before him with a resolute kindness glinting in his eyes, then to Uraraka who was vibrating with excitement as she watched his expression intently, and then to Midoriya. Midoriya had been watching him as though looking away might cause Shoto to dissipate out of existence. The boy seemed on the cusp of a nervous outburst as he watched him, studying his face with an unwavering fervor. Shoto couldn't help the oncoming changes in his expression, but for possibly the first time in his life, he felt that he didn't want to. A smile, possibly one of the most genuine ones he'd ever shown, steadily spread across his features with surprising ease, and the barrier came crashing down. Uraraka let out a high-pitched squeal of joy, grasped Midoriya by the shoulder and shook him in her excitement and then engulfed him in a stifling hug. Ida patted him kindly on the back with a warm smile in place while Midoriya's laughter chimed somewhere off to one side, Shoto's gut doing somersaults at the very sound of it. It had been a few pure moments of bliss, surrounded by his friends with all other thoughts pushed to the sidelines, but back in the present when Shoto climbed the steps to his front door, reached for his keys and the door suddenly swung open before he'd even put them in the lock, his brain froze. His sister Fuyumi stood there, her face peering through the gap at the door, and she looked utterly frazzled, her harried expression all too clear. "Shoto dash," she whispered, sparing him a second to glance over her shoulder at the corridor behind her. "Shoto," father's in another one of his rages. His stomach sank like a stone in water, the warm happiness in his eyes rapidly freezing over. "What dash? Go out for a bit?" she said, desperation taking hold as she began begging him with her eyes. Please. No, I can't leave you to dash. An audible crash could be heard from somewhere inside the household, and in spite of himself, Shoto couldn't repress the slight flinch that ran up his spine. A roar of pure rage sounded a second later, and when his sister turned back towards him, she looked utterly despaired. Please, Shoto. I can't let him take it out on you again with that med training. He stared back at her, his own face falling grimly as he searched her face for a trace of hesitance. Upon finding none and hating himself for agreeing, for abandoning her to deal with a monster all by herself, he gave a tiny nod and balled his fists at his sides, doing his utmost to keep his composure in front of her. Whenever he became doubtful about whether his hatred for his father was justified, it was times like these that solidified the firm yes. As he turned away from the house to vacate the property once more, something gripped his hand, trembling and cold, and he glanced back over his shoulder. Somehow, a strong, brave smile had graced his sister's face despite her obvious fear, and Shoto found himself wondering how on earth she had remained so good-hearted after years and years of Endeavor's neglect. Stay safe, Sho. I'll call when it's okay to come back. Nodding once more, he squeezed her palm lightly and let go, shoving his shaking hands in his pockets and trudging back down the steps to the street. Looking back at the house only once and finding the door firmly shut and the curtains tightly drawn, he shut his eyes for a moment and took off down the road at a jog, still wearing his uniform, his bag with all of his school equipment still on his back. Izuku was busy even without All Might's training regime, what with school work and errands from home to carry out, but it was in moments like these, jogging along the riverside bank in the city park, that Izuku realized he barely had room to breathe in his timetable on the best of days. He glanced at his watch briefly in the rapidly darkening light and wiped his brow with his forearm, pleased to find that he was slightly ahead of schedule. Trailing his eyes forward again, he grinned to himself, feeling pleased with the day's progression, and it was then that he spotted it. A figure sat on a bench not far from him, completely alone and with a workbook awkwardly propped up on one leg. A rucksack, that was definitely a school bag, Izuku deduced, sat beside them with papers sticking out the top, and a gray blazer was draped on the seat next to them, abandoned despite the slight chill taking hold in the evening air. Slowing to a crawl, Izuku curiously drew closer to them, wondering who on earth would be out here this late doing work, of all things, but when he became near enough to them to distinguish a very familiar mop of red and white hair, his stomach lurched. Why on earth was Todoroki out here? Was he okay? The silently working boy seemed to feel Izuku's eyes on him, however, for he turned his gaze up in his direction and a look of recognition flitted across his face before he schooled it again into one of pleasant calm. Izuku himself smiled nervously from afar, jogging over and waving all the while. Hey, Todoroki! How come you're here at this time? Glancing down at the paper propped on the boy's knee, Izuku realized with a start that it was a sheet of maths equations, and that he was diligently working through them out in the open. Hey, is that our homework? How come you're doing it here? Todoroki looked uncomfortable for a second and he shifted under his classmate's gaze, adjusting the paper and straightening his shirt. I forgot my keys. Wait, for real? Izuku replied, thoroughly taken aback. He carefully took a seat beside his friend, swinging his legs back and forth beneath him as he observed him. You should have called, you could have crashed at my place for a bit. Todoroki looked up at him then, and Izuku wasn't sure if it was the lack of light playing tricks on his eyes, but he could have sworn he'd seen the boy's expression soften and his shoulders loosen up before he turned away again, shaking his head. No, don't worry. I should be able to go back soon anyway, but thank you for the offer, Midoriya. I appreciate it. Izuku nodded and then there was a pause as he tried to figure out what to say next, what to do to keep the conversation going. So, hey, aren't you cold? He remarked, indicating to the blazer Todoroki had discarded beside him. Like you can talk. His friend retorted, nodding at Izuku's short-sleeved, sweaty training top, and if Izuku hadn't been too busy chuckling by way of response, he may have stopped to appreciate the way the evening sunset picked out the pinks and golds in Todoroki's hair. Or the way his face seemed to glow in those rare moments whenever a small smile graced his features and his eyes crinkled around the edges. Or when, I can go back now. Really? The boy nodded, capped his biro with the lid and began to pack up his belongings, relief clearly evident in his eyes. My sister says it's okay now. Immediately, Todoroki's phrasing threw him off. Okay to return, what does that mean? And it was all Midoriya could do to keep the concern out of his next words as he felt it really wasn't his business. That's great then. Once Todoroki had finished tugging on his blazer and Midoriya had helpfully handed his bag to him, the two of them glanced around awkwardly before Izuku broke the tension with a cough. I'm going this way. He stammered out, jerking his thumb behind him back in the direction he had come from. Me too. The air eased and they fell into step beside one another, Todoroki in his uniform and Izuku in his running gear. They remained in amicable silence for a short while longer before a thought struck Izuku and he spoke up thoughtfully. Hey, what do you think of this trip Aizawa mentioned? Think it'll be pretty soon? I imagine so, came the reply. Because I'll bet it's a trip relating to the hero course since we haven't had one of those yet, and there's a pretty high likelihood it'll involve practical activities as Aizawa made it sound rather official. I think it'll be fun, though God, I wish I knew what it was. From beside him, Shoto nodded and made a noise of agreement and Izuku smiled sheepishly, glad that Todoroki seemed perfectly content to listen to his muttering antics. Even if he didn't exactly get a response, it was somehow better that way for both of them. Todoroki could listen from within his comfort zone and Izuku could talk without fearing the ridicule he received constantly before joining UA. He kept rambling animatedly, gesturing with his hands and enthusiasm shining in his eyes, and from beside him Shoto watched him with rapt attention, unable to quite tear his eyes away from the boy with amazingly green hair and a stunning amount of freckles. It rained for the next few days, heavily at first though growing lighter and more sporadic over time, and Shoto found himself shaking his umbrella off at the door once again before depositing it along with everyone else's to dry and strolling over to his shoe locker. Slipping his trainers off and stowing them away, he tugged on his indoor pair, adjusted them at the heel and then reached into his BRST pocket for his future diary, taking it out. They had a practical lesson first thing, and he decided it'd save him hassle to drop it off sooner rather than later. He was confused, therefore, and more than a little taken aback, to find that the small door that usually shut his cell safely out of harm's way refused to lock. He furrowed his brow slightly, re-inputting his key code and trying the safe a few more times, before deducting that there was definitely something wrong with his locker, and not that the problem lay in any fault of his own. The lock simply didn't activate, the door staying put when shut but entirely accessible from the outside still. Well shit, he thought, frowning to himself. That's not good. Glancing around and finding himself almost alone aside from a group of Gen Ed students chatting a few paces away, he stowed his future diary back into the inside pocket of his blazer, picked up his bag once more and made for the main staircase, this time heading for the principal's office rather than his classroom. Upon arriving, he slowed to a halt outside the door and gently rapped his knuckles against the polished wooden surface, hearing the sound carry through into the room beyond. There was a shuffle on the other side, and then it swung inwards. He was greeted by the face of his homeroom teacher, staring rather gloomily down at him with dark shadows underneath his eyes. He seemed more agitated than usual, though when asking Shoto what he was doing outside the headmaster's office, his voice was calm, affable, even. My locker isn't working. Within a second Aizawa threw a glance over his shoulder, exchanged a haggard, meaningful look with the head teacher, who sat at his desk, from what Shoto could see, and announced, "There's another one." "Oh dear," came the ever-benign voice of Principal Nedzu, who promptly hopped down from his raised seat behind his desk and trotted around it. "Do come in, Todoroki." Yes, sit here now." Aizawa stepped away from the entrance to the room and looked pointedly at him, jerking his head and indicating at him to enter the office. Shuffling inside, Shoto immediately spotted another student already seated on a couch by the wall, her hands clutched around the straps of her bag as she tried her best not to look concerned. She raised her eyes to meet his and sat up straighter in recognition. "Ah, Todoroki, you too?" Uraraka quizzed as he took a seat beside her, worry etched into her face. She then turned to their head teacher. "Our lockers are next to each other, sir." "That's so, is it?" The man creature? Animal? Mumbled, curiosity evident. Well, the lockers themselves are very new, so we expected there to be some bugs at least, but dash. He then looked up to Aizawa, who was leaning against the polished wooden desk. Timing's rather cumbersome, no? Silence fell over them then as the adults seemed to be going over possible solutions to their predicament. I have a meeting with the education secretary this morning, so leaving them here with me is a no-go, I'm afraid. He seemed to give their homeroom teacher a sideways, all-too-knowing glance, and at that Aizawa let out a drawn-out, long-suffering sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose. Fine, he lamented. Fine. You know it's the safest option, and you are only supervising them today. 13 should be the one teaching. Yes, I know. Their teacher huffed. All Shoto and Uraraka could do was watch on from the sidelines as a plan of action that made zero sense to either of them was formed. After all, the principal added, hopping back onto his desk chair and rifling through papers. The tiny, astute look he threw the pro-hero didn't go unnoticed, however. You are their homeroom teacher. They're your responsibility. Aizawa raised his eyes to the heavens then as though looking to God for an escape route, but when none came he grimaced, composed himself, and walked over to his students. Sorry guys, but we're on a trip today, so I'm going to have to take care of yourselves for you. School policy, I'm afraid. Shoto saw Uraraka glance at him out of the corner of his eye, clearly looking to him to know how to react to this revelation. Upon seeing him extracting his future diary from his pocket, though, she scrambled to do the same. They each handed their flip phones over to their teacher and watched him seal them away in a secure pouch on his belt. While the situation wasn't in any way desirable, Shoto couldn't help but silently agree that, with Nedzu out of the picture, there was possibly no safer place their flip phones could be. I'll be sure to notify your parents, came the voice of the headmaster, once more. And I'll call the company that installed the hardware, so expect them up and running again very soon, children, he reassured them goon-naturedly. Just enjoy your trip today. Shoto didn't even think his father would care at all. There was every possibility, too, that if the school called his home number, Fuyumi would get the information, and then he wouldn't have to worry about his father knowing at all. Deciding to cast all thoughts about his father aside, he rose to his feet alongside Uraraka and made for the door, nodding to his teacher on the way and being sure to shut the door once outside. He and Uraraka then began walking side by side towards their form room, silence hanging over them at first before his companion broke it. What rotten luck, she said, more so to herself than at Shoto. I know they'll be fine with Aizawa, but I can't help but worry. He nodded, making a noise of assent in his throat as they began ascending the staircase. But hey, did you hear? The trip is today. I mean of all days, but still dash. She punched the air a few times, enthusiasm evident in her every movement. And Nedzu mentioned that 13 be teaching us. 13. How cool is that? I can't wait to tell to you. Nodding again, Shoto let his feet carry him to their homeroom on autopilot as his mind wandered elsewhere. More specifically, to the look his father had worn upon Shoto's arrival home that night. The look that made his BLD run cold and his lungs freeze despite the man's fiery temperament and scolding gaze. Notes. Finally. 30K plus words. I couldn't have done it without each and every one of you guys, I mean it. And this chapter is slightly longer than usual too, so I hope you enjoyed that. School starts back up for me in less than a week, so no doubt updates will be less frequent, unfortunately. I hope to start increasing my chapter word count to make up for it, though. As usual, drop a kudos or a comment if you enjoyed / if you see any issues, and if you want come yell at me on the hell site. Love you guys. P.S. Enormous shout out to @Londi_Vika for helping me solidify the plot in the upcoming chapters. Please also go and check out her GCFIC, it is amazing. Chapter 15. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Izuka beamed when he spotted Uraraka and Todoroki entering the Class 1A homeroom together that morning, gesturing them over with a friendly wave and a call of their names. They both turned toward him at the sound, Uraraka's face lighting up and Todoroki's relaxing from a tension Izuku only noticed once it had dissipated. Trying not to let the furrow of his brow show, he shook off his concern and smiled as they walked down the aisles between the desks. Hey Deku! Uraraka chirped happily, tucking her skirt underneath her as she sat on the corner of his desk. You feeling better after yesterday? Ojiro sure packs a punch, huh? Yeah, definitely. He replied, sheepishly scratching at his cheek. Much better. Good, because guess what? She said, leaning forward with a feverish glint in her eyes. What? He stammered, leaning back slightly to escape her personal bubble. The trip Aizawa told us about is today. She cried, throwing her arms up and almost shaking with excitement. Several people nearby turned around at her words, shock present on their faces. A trace of smoke rose from Bakugo's palms as he glared daggers at Uraraka, hands sparking threateningly as a warning for her to keep her voice down. Where Izuku tried unsuccessfully to suppress a flinch, she merely stuck her tongue out playfully and turned back to her friend, smiling once more. How do you know? Izuku said, recovering from his momentary mental freeze. Oh, Aizawa mentioned it in the principal's office when we were there 10 minutes ago. I don't know if he realized he'd let it slip, but Wait, Izuku muttered, his gaze flicking between the contentedly smiling Uraraka and a placidly listening Todoroki. Why were you guys in the head teacher's office? He almost choked on the air in his own lungs when Todoroki told him that both his and Uraraka's future diaries were being kept on Aizawa's person for the duration of the trip. What really? He exclaimed, worry and panic taking hold as looked to his friend. I know the cell lockers are only big enough for one phone, but surely Nezu could look after them? They'd be safer in his office. That's just it though. The girl perched on his table said, swing her legs back and forth distractedly with a sad frown on her face. Nezu's going out for the morning, he can't just leave them in there unattended. Izuku stared back at her, the situation not sitting right with him at all but being wholly unable to do anything about it. It felt wrong that someone else should have possession of his friend's future diaries, but at the same time he didn't doubt their teacher could look after them. He was a pro-hero after all. Just then, said teacher entered the classroom, looking as tired and forlorn as ever as he took to the speaker's podium. Get to your seats. He gruffed out, and Izuku's friends bade him quiet farewells before settling down and facing the front. I have an announcement to make. The room stilled very suddenly, every student going quiet in anticipation of what their teacher might say. They could only pray it wasn't another lecture or something similar. We have an off-site training trip today. The class breathed a collective sigh of relief that none of them knew they'd been holding, and excitement swept across the group at once, chatter starting up. It only died down again at the hand their homeroom teacher raised impatiently a few moments later. We will be doing practical hero course exercises, so everyone is to change into their suits now and meet up at the front door. Dismissed. Barely 20 minutes later, Izuku felt oddly self-conscious in his Yudata sports kit when stood beside his classmates in their hero outfits. His own was out for repairs, and while he'd rather train in actual clothes over tatters, a part of him still wished he'd been able to don his suit too. Cheer up, Deta, Uraraka said, nudging him in the ribs as they all filed onto the cross-campus transfer bus. We're going to be learning under 13 today. 13? The space hero? At the sight of his friend's jubilant nodding he smiled, excitement bubbling in his eyes as he stepped onto the bus behind her. He ended up sitting beside Tsuyu with Ida opposite him across the aisle, and as the last of the class filed onto the vehicle Izuku snagged the end of Todoroki's sleeve and patted the seat beside him. The boy said a brief farewell to Yaoyorozu who moved to the back to commute alongside Uraraka, before he slid into the chair. Hey Todoroki, are you sure this whole Aizawa has your future diary thing is a good idea? It seems like a rushed solution to me. The boy beside him seemed to ponder his words for a moment, before saying, well, it was rushed. Nezu couldn't have known the lockers would fail, and on a day when he was out too. I guess you're right, Izuku mumbled, still unsure. He rallied himself though, braving a smile despite his worry. And you're okay? Todoroki looked at him, a puzzled expression in place as his eyes flicked back and forth between Izuku's own before fixing on his knees in thought. He seemed to be attempting to work out how he felt, also unsure about the situation, but eventually he relaxed and matched Izuku's gaze again. Yeah, thanks, Midoriya. I'll be fine. Welcome to the USJ. As Class 1A crossed the threshold of the Yudata Rescue Training Facility, 20 pairs of fascinated eyes trailed up to the ceiling and roamed over the numerous biome areas situated around the dome's circumference. Many people let out giddy laughter and impressed remarks at the sheer size of the zones, but every gaze returned to the rescue hero when they next spoke. Being a hero isn't just about fighting villains and apprehending the bad guy, they began, taking in every eager expression and attentive countenance. You have to learn how to rescue not only civilians caught in the fire but your fellow colleagues out on the field too, because some of you will undoubtedly injure yourselves in the future if you haven't already. Shoto felt rather than saw Midoriya shrink in on himself to his left, and he had to repress a chuckle at his friend's haphazardness. This facility is designed to replicate the many different disaster zones you may come across as a pro. You will be put into groups by your tutor and allocated a biome accordingly, from which 2 of your team will feign injury. The rest of you must rescue them. Enthusiastic whispers and mutterings sounded at that, along with a not-so-quiet exclamation of, "I'll kill you all if you leave me to die," from Bakugo, and 13 seemed satisfied with their explanation of the day's activities, turning to Aizawa to begin the team assignments. It was impossible to miss, however, the way their homeroom teacher stepped up to the hero when their eyes met and gently steered them away from the class with their elbow. Words were exchanged, and it seemed Midoriya had noticed it too. The boy looked up at Shoto, and he met his friend's grave expression with one of his own. The adults broke apart after their brief exchange, 13 nodding and quickly leaning over to catch the teacher's last words before facing the students once more. They never got the chance to decide who'd be in which biome, however, for everyone's train of thought came to an abrupt and grinding halt. A large, swirling mist unfurled before them, darker than a black hole and imposing over all of them. Confusion gripped everyone present, first morphing into a sick realization as a hand appeared out from the shadows, then to a suffocating terror when a masked figure, no, several figures, clawed their way through. The dread weighed down on their faces and made it impossible to breathe, and from beside him Shoto heard Midoriya's sharp intake of breath, saw him take a few, faltering steps back, and felt the panic radiating off him in waves. Their classmates were no longer all smiles and laughs, carefree attitudes gone in a microsecond and fear filling the void in almost every case. "Whoa, what is that, more battle robots?" Kirishima said, shielding his eyes from the light overhead to better get a look at the scene unfolding before them, his voice unsteady. "Like in the entrance exam?" "No, get back." Aizawa cut in, throwing an arm out to block their path with one hand, his eyes darting across the scene evidently taking in as much information as humanly possible in a few short moments. "They're villains." The teacher then whipped around suddenly and rapidly approached his students, and it was with a jolt to the stomach that Shoto realized why the man was heading his way. He hastened to give the pro his full and undivided attention despite the growing anxiety building in his doing his utmost to keep his unease at bay. After ushering Uraraka over, Aizawa quickly undid the secure lock of the cell case on his utility belt and withdrew 2 flip phones, one red and white, the other pink and black. Holding them out, he pressed them into his students' palms and began whispering hurriedly, eyes darting between the 2 minors. "I'm putting your lives in your hands. Stay safe and don't get yourselves killed." And with that he reeled back and powered off towards the main part of the facility, fixing his goggles in place and leaving 2 stunned, thoroughly shaken teenagers in his wake. Shoto blinked dazedly at the girl beside him, and Uraraka's eyes slid from the retreating form of their teacher down to her cell, terror written all too plainly across her face. Izuku's head hurt. Within the last 10 minutes alone he'd been thrown up into the air, forced to break 2 of his fingers in order to ensure the safety of his classmates, and rendered utterly useless on the sidelines as his teacher was brutally beaten into SBMsen by an enormous monster dubbed Nomu by its commander. It had overpowered the trained adult to the point of exhaustion, repeatedly smashing the pro-hero into the concrete beneath him with the air of a child and its plaything, mindless and utterly unaware. It seemed to take to the ringleaders every command with unsettling ease, wiping out their teacher in a matter of minutes. And looking upon the bloodied and broken form of his teacher, Izuku couldn't help but feel bile rise up his throat at the thought of his close friend's future diaries being on his person, crushed beneath him, splintered and shattered and destroyed beyond repair. He clamped a shaky hand to his mouth and tried to force the images from his mind. Uraraka wasn't hurt, she wasn't, and Todoroki was fine. He'd made it out of his zone unscathed, enemies defeated, he was safe, they were together, they absolutely weren't. Let's leave behind a few dead kids, Kurogyri. And Izuku felt like he was staring into the face of evil itself, horror swirling unbidden in his stomach and his windpipe constricting as the villain came closer and closer. His form approached at a dizzying speed, but Izuku perceived it at least 10 times slower than in reality, his brain yelling at him to move, do something, act, you useless idiot. But he couldn't move, couldn't do anything, and couldn't act, his body at least a few paces behind his mind, refusing to follow through, as a hand lunged into vision, reaching out for the girl beside him, about to destroy her. If someone screamed in that moment, the sound fell on deaf ears, the only thing registering in his brain being that of panic-induced white noise, and the only thing in his sight being the image of his friend's face encased by a villain's palm. Oh ho ho dash, the man chuckled, his laughter low and deathly, and his only visible eye was crazed and demonic behind the dismembered hand gripping his face. You really are pretty cool, Eraserhead. Shoto had overpowered a group of 20 violent adults with unsettling ease, all encased in ice and left in the landslide zone to shiver after divulging all the information he considered valuable. He made his way back to the entrance as quickly as his feet would carry him at a jog, hastening to relay the knowledge back to someone who would know what to do with it and to check on his fellow classmates. He had no idea where they were, and when the thought of any of them being injured surged up in his mind, he shoved it down as quickly as it had arisen. That didn't bear thinking about. As he jogged, he felt the weight of his flip phone against his leg, stowed safely in a sealable pocket and hidden away to the best of his ability considering how much notice he had been given to come up with a solution. Upon reaching the entryway, he found it still littered with students who had either returned there like he had, or had apparently remained put when the warp gate activated. He immediately began raking the group for signs of a familiar head of short brown hair, and upon spotting Uraraka a few meters away, he made a beeline for her. Uraraka dashed, he said, and her head turned at the direct address, curiosity evident amongst the obvious fear dominating her expression. You're okay? She hummed a noise of assent and nodded briefly. 13th's badly injured and Ida's gone to get help. I don't know where Deku and Dash. Sheet Dash, he cursed, beginning to fumble with his pocket and his brow creasing as he withdrew his cell. Now was not the time to worry about people figuring things out, there were far more pressing matters at hand. Oh, she exclaimed from beside him, and not a moment later she too undid a small compartment in her hero suit belt and extracted her flip phone, hands shaking and shoulders trembling in her anxiety. Don't drop your guard, Shoto instructed, glancing over his own shoulder to ensure their position before flipping open his cell. He had barely even registered the presence of words on the screen, however, when a sound from beside him tore his attention from the device in his palm and onto the girl beside him. What he saw branded across her face in the next moment stalled all thought processes completely. An utterly vulnerable look of abject terror had taken the place of her once fretful countenance, tears pooling in her eyes and spilling over onto her rosy cheeks unchecked and unnoticed. A strangled noise escaped her, and before Shoto could ask what was wrong, a piercing cry of pained despair ripped from her throat and echoed into the near silence surrounding them. She sank to her knees at the foot of the stairs, shaking uncontrollably, totally unable to tear her gaze from her future diary. Fearing the absolute worst, Shoto hastened to read the words of his own flip phone, the blue light of the small LED screen greeting his eyes and showing him the future of Midoriya Izuku, his soulmate. Not for the first time, though, his brain could only focus on the last few lines of the prediction. 10:20 a.m., take Aizawa away from the battle. 10:22 a.m., break legs and arm attacking the warp gate villain. 10:22 a.m., attacked by Shigaraki. Dead end. He blinked down at the words, trying to comprehend them. Slowly, as the meaning started to kick in, his hands began to shake and his lungs worked furiously to draw in air, his CC racked by an agonizing pain. He couldn't breathe properly, his mind was fogged by panic, and the words, dead and each, had drilled a hole straight through his heart, the characters permanently branded onto his retina. He had only ever heard about dead ends before in hushed tones, almost as though they were tabooed, as though mentioning them would result in one making an untimely appearance. He didn't know anyone who had seen one, no one ever spoke of them, and he had no past encounter with them to work with. All he knew was that a dead end meant Midoriya was going to die. His body was stalled, his arms and legs weighted and as heavy as lead, and he couldn't summon up the ability to draw breath, but conjuring every last shred of energy remaining to him, Shoto wrenched one leg from its spot on the floor, glued to the concrete, and took a step forward. His other leg followed suit, his movements slowed as though he were wading through mud rather than walking on land, and after much effort and willpower, Shoto was flying across the facility, his palm gripping onto his future diary, the words, dead indeed, still displayed on screen. Izuku felt like he was going to be sick, and not for the first time that morning either. He was the only person present and conscious at the USJ who knew about All Might's true form, about his declining health, and about his time limit, and right before his eyes, the hero in question had thrown himself headfirst into danger in order to save his students and was now bleeding from his side, his old wound reopened and hemorrhaging. The Nomu may have been defeated and the battle virtually won, but Izuku's mentor looked on the brink of collapse, his BLD loss severe and incredibly worrying. A few of their classmates were scattered around having witnessed the past fistfight, and if they saw, Izuku's mind jolted at the thought of his classmates. He hadn't seen any of them since the pressurized blast All Might had defeated the Nomu with. Were they okay? Where were Todoroki and Uraraka now? Were they injured? He was being driven to near hysterics with worry, and thoughts of his close friends were drastically clouding his judgment as the Warp Gate villain readied another attack against All Might. He didn't know what to do. Then a shout, loud and hoarse and terribly desperate, tore through the air and pierced straight through his skull. Izuku! Stay away from Shigaraki! Whirling around, he came eye-to-eye with Todoroki. Shoto stood 20 feet away, his red and white patterned cell clutched in one fist and a look of pure anguish marring his features. Something clicked inside his brain in that moment and his eyes widened, his breath leaving him in a rush of air. The sight of Todoroki staring straight at him, warning him of an imminent threat, holding onto his future diary. Behind you, careful. Tearing his eyes away from his friend with no small amount of effort, Izuku turned and saw the black mist bearing down on his mentor. Fueled by sheer panic and dread, each coursing through his veins in equal measure, he sacrificed his left leg with a one-for-all charged jump and leapt forward, biting back a cry of pain as he felt the limb break beneath him. Stay away from Shigaraki. He could have laughed aloud when the familiar gray hand with cracked and peeling skin loomed out of the darkness and moved towards him. How odd it was, to know what was coming before it came, Izuku realized. How exhilarating. Prepared for the ambush where he may not have been otherwise, Izuku let his weight bring his fall towards the ground and he tumbled beneath the dismembered arm, skidding along the concrete ground to avoid it and pushing forward into the mist where he was sure the villain's body resided. Using his other, uninjured leg, he surged forward with one last burst of energy and reared back a powered-up fist. He felt the punch connect, the weight of the hit transfer, and the Warp Gate villain's body flew backwards and away from All Might. Shigaraki sent flying with him. Elation had ignited his veins for 1,000 different reasons by the time he registered the teacher's arrival, and despite his various injuries and 3 broken limbs, despite the horror he had felt earlier when they had seemed so utterly overwhelmed, and despite the casualties their group had sustained, his worn-out, exhausted brain couldn't prevent the smile that found its way onto his face when he spotted Todoroki. He had sunk to the floor exactly where he had been moments previously, and relief flooded his features, tears in his mismatched eyes. The boy's future diary sat limply in one hand, his gaze glued to the screen, and Izuku knew in his heart that whatever it was telling Shoto now was probably very different to what it had shown him barely a minute before.